Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The call came in at 3:47 a.m. on a muggy August morning that made Sheriff Tyler Rodriguez's uniform stick to his back before he'd even left his house. 23 years in law enforcement, the last 8 as sheriff of Suncrest County, and Tyler had never gotten used to Florida's oppressive summer humidity that seemed to press down like a wet blanket, even in the pre-dawn darkness. At 51, he'd seen his share of strange cases along the Gulf Coast, but what waited for him in the small fishing village of Cypress Cove would challenge everything he thought he knew about his county and the people who called it home. Cypress Cove sat at the mouth of the Suncrest River, where dark tannin-stained water met the Emerald Gulf in a collision of colors that tourists photographed but locals barely noticed anymore. The village had maybe 300 residents during off-season, swelling to nearly 1,000 when the seasonal fishing crowd arrived with their charter boats and deep pockets. Old Florida families had worked these waters for generations. Pattersons, Turners, Clarks, their weathered faces and calloused hands telling stories of nets full of mullet, red snapper, and grouper pulled from the Gulf's depths in the kind of back-breaking work that built character and destroyed bodies in equal measure. The voice on the radio belonged to Deputy Shane Garcia, and Tyler could hear the tension cutting through the static like a knife through morning fog. "Sheriff, we got a situation at the Cypress Cove Marina. Blake Patterson called it in about an hour ago. Says 3 boats went out yesterday morning and none came back. All experienced captains, Sheriff. This ain't like them." Tyler knew Blake Patterson. 4th-generation fisherman, steady as they come. The kind of man who could read weather patterns in cloud formations and predict fish behavior from water temperature. Blake wasn't the type to panic over boats that stayed out overnight. These waters could be unpredictable, and experienced captains knew when to ride out rough weather rather than risk running for shore in dangerous conditions. But 3 boats simultaneously? That got Tyler's attention in a way that made his coffee taste bitter and his stomach clench with the familiar dread that preceded every major case. "What's got Blake worried?" Tyler asked, already reaching for his keys and checking his service weapon out of habit developed over 2 decades of answering calls that started routine and ended with gunfire or worse. "All 3 boats, Sheriff. The Miss Carolyn, Sweet Dreams, and the Marlin's Rest. Different captains, different fishing grounds, different departure times. Blake says it ain't like them to all no-show at the same time without radioing in. These boys are religious about checking in, especially during tourist season when the Coast Guard's paying attention." Tyler's gut tightened like a fishing line under strain. The Miss Carolyn belonged to Cody Turner, a veteran captain who'd been working these waters longer than Tyler had been in law enforcement. A man who could navigate by stars and smell fish from 5 miles away. Sweet Dreams was captained by Trevor Wilson, younger but equally experienced, known for bringing in consistent catches even when other boats came back empty. The Marlin's Rest ran under Captain Dustin Clark, whose family had been pulling fish from the Gulf since before World War II, when German U-boats prowled these same waters looking for merchant vessels to sink. Tyler's mind was already working through possibilities as he drove the 30-mile stretch of coastal highway toward Cypress Cove. Mechanical failures could disable boats, but 3 simultaneously seemed unlikely. Weather could force boats to seek shelter, but yesterday had been crystal clear with light winds. Pirates were virtually unknown in these waters, and drug runners typically avoided areas with heavy fishing activity. Medical emergencies were possible, but again, 3 boats suggested something more systematic than random bad luck. By the time Tyler reached Cypress Cove, The eastern sky showed the first pale hint of dawn, painting the Gulf in shades of rose and gold that reminded him why he'd chosen to spend his career in this corner of Florida rather than accepting offers from larger departments inland. The marina stretched along a series of weathered docks that had survived countless hurricanes and tropical storms. Boat slips mostly empty in the pre-dawn darkness, except for the early birds already puttering toward the channel with their running lights cutting through the humid air like fireflies. The smell hit him immediately, that distinctive blend of fish, diesel fuel, salt air, and creosote that defined every working marina along the coast and brought back memories of childhood fishing trips with his grandfather. Blake Patterson stood at the end of the main dock, a weathered man in his 60s whose family had worked these waters since the 1920s when fishing was still done with hand lines and wooden boats that required constant maintenance just to stay afloat. His grandfather had built the first commercial fishing operation in Cypress Cove during the Depression, and Blake had inherited not just the business, but an intimate knowledge of every current, reef, sandbar, and fishing ground within 50 miles of shore. The kind of knowledge that couldn't be learned from charts or GPS units, but had to be absorbed through decades of watching watercolors, feeling current changes, and understanding the subtle signs that separated successful fishermen from those who went home empty-handed. "Sheriff Rodriguez," Blake said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine concern mixed with the frustration of a man accustomed to solving problems but facing one that defied solution. "Glad you're here. This ain't right, not at all. I've been working these waters for 43 years, and I ain't never seen anything like this." Tyler had worked dozens of overdue vessel cases during his career. Most ended with sheepish captains explaining mechanical problems or weather delays that had prevented them from returning on schedule. A few involved genuine emergencies, engines failures that left boats drifting, medical situations that required Coast Guard evacuations, occasionally weather that turned worse than expected and forced crews to ride out storms in protected anchorages. But 3 boats simultaneously? That suggested something beyond ordinary maritime mishaps. "Tell me about yesterday," Tyler said, pulling out his notebook and pen while mentally cataloging the empty boat slips and trying to remember the last time he'd seen this many commercial vessels missing from Cypress Cove at the same time. Blake's weathered hands gestured toward the empty slips where the 3 missing boats normally moored, his movements carrying the unconscious precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with ropes and lines and mechanical equipment that could kill you if you didn't treat it with proper respect. All 3 boats left between 5 and 6 a.m., just like always. Cody on the Miss Carolyn was heading to the ledges about 25 miles out. Good grouper country where the bottom drops off into deep water. Trevor and Sweet Dreams planned to work the near-shore reefs, maybe 15 miles out, targeting snapper and amberjack around the artificial reefs the state dropped back in the 90s. Dustin on the Marlin's Rest was going for deep-water grouper, probably 35, 40 miles out where the big fish cruise the drop-offs looking for bait schools. Different directions, different fishing grounds, Tyler noted, already understanding that whatever had happened to these boats, it wasn't a localized incident that had affected all 3 in the same area at the same time. "Exactly right, Sheriff. And all 3 are solid captains with good boats and experienced crews. Cody's been running that route to the ledges for 20 years, knows every piece of bottom structure between here and the 100-fathom curve. Trevor knows the nearshore waters better than anyone half his age, grew up fishing these reefs with his daddy and granddaddy. And Dustin..." Blake shook his head slowly. "Dustin could find his way home in a hurricane with his eyes closed and both engines dead. That man's got salt water in his veins and fish sense that you can't teach." Tyler studied the marina's layout while Blake talked, noting the main channel that ran straight out to the Gulf, deep enough for the larger charter boats and commercial vessels that needed draft clearance. Smaller craft could take any of several routes through the shallower back bays and coastal waterways, But the 3 missing boats were all substantial vessels that would have used the main channel for departure and return. Any radio contact yesterday? These boys usually check in? That's what's got me spooked, Sheriff, Blake admitted, his voice dropping to the confidential tone of a man sharing information he wasn't sure he should be sharing. Usually these boys check in around noon, let us know how the fishing's going, maybe warn about weather building or let other boats know about good fishing locations. Maybe again in the afternoon if they're having luck and plan to stay out late. Yesterday, nothing. Not a word from any of them on any frequency. Weather conditions? Blake shook his head emphatically. Perfect conditions, Sheriff. Light winds out of the southeast at maybe 8-10 knots. Seas running 1 to 2 feet with a long period that makes for comfortable fishing. The kind of day when you'd send your grandmother out fishing and not worry about her coming home safe. I checked the marine forecast 3 times yesterday, thinking maybe I'd missed something, but it was textbook perfect fishing weather. Tyler walked to the edge of the dock, looking out over water that appeared black in the pre-dawn darkness, but would soon transform into the brilliant emerald green that made the Gulf Coast famous among tourists and fishermen alike. The Gulf could be deceptive, looking peaceful one moment, turning dangerous the next when weather fronts collided or summer thunderstorms built with shocking speed. But Blake was right about yesterday's conditions. Tyler remembered checking the marine forecast himself yesterday morning out of habit developed from years of coordinating marine rescues and understanding that Gulf weather could change faster than a politician's promises. "You try raising them on the radio?" Tyler asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer from Blake's troubled expression. "Called every half hour starting at noon yesterday. Nothing on channel 16, nothing on their working frequencies, nothing on the emergency channels. That's when I started getting worried, because these boys are professional about radio communications. They know the Coast Guard monitors everything, and they know that staying in touch is part of staying safe out there." Channel 16 was the universal hailing and distress frequency, monitored continuously by the Coast Guard and most commercial vessels. Any captain in trouble would broadcast there first, knowing that help would respond immediately. The fact that 3 experienced captains had gone silent simultaneously suggested something beyond ordinary mechanical problems or bad weather, something that had prevented them from using their radios or had happened so suddenly that they hadn't had time to call for help. Tyler's radio crackled with static before Garcia's voice came through clearly. "Sheriff, this is Garcia. Coast Guard's launching a search pattern at first light. They're requesting any additional information on the missing vessels, registration numbers, descriptions, last known positions, crew complements, safety equipment. The usual stuff for search and rescue operations." Tyler keyed his radio. "Tell them I'm at the marina now, getting details from Blake Patterson. I'll have complete vessel descriptions and last known positions in 10 minutes. Also tell them I want to coordinate directly with the search coordinator. This situation has some unusual aspects that might affect search planning." As dawn broke over the Gulf with the kind of spectacular sunrise that made Florida postcards famous, Tyler could see the water stretching endlessly to the horizon, its surface barely disturbed by gentle swells that caught and reflected the morning light, like scattered diamonds. Somewhere out there, 3 boats with experienced crews had simply vanished without leaving any obvious clues about their fate. The enormity of the search area was daunting. Thousands of square miles of open water where boats could disappear as completely as stones dropped into the ocean. Blake provided detailed information on each vessel, while Tyler took notes and tried to spot patterns that might explain the disappearances. Radio call signs, engine specifications, fuel capacity, safety equipment, crew complement, typical operating procedures. The Miss Carolyn carried Cody Turner and his nephew Garrett Moore, a young man learning the fishing business from one of the best captains on the coast. Sweet Dreams had Trevor Wilson and deckhand Landon Foster aboard, both experienced men who'd worked together for 5 years. The Marlin's Rest ran with Dustin Clark and his longtime partner Tanner Adams, whose partnership went back 15 years and had weathered everything the Gulf could throw at them. 8 men total, Tyler noted, doing quick calculations about survival time in Gulf waters. All experienced fishermen? Every one of them, Sheriff, Blake confirmed with the certainty of a man who'd known these people for decades. Garrett's the youngest at 24, but he's been working boats since he was 16 and knows more about fishing than most captains twice his age. These ain't weekend warriors or tourist boat crews, Sheriff. These are professional fishermen who know every inch of these waters and respect what the Gulf can do to people who don't take it seriously. Tyler studied the marina's radio setup, noting the sophisticated communication equipment that allowed Blake to stay in touch with his fleet and coordinate with other fishing operations along the coast. Most commercial fishing operations maintained constant contact with their boats, both for safety reasons and to coordinate fishing information that could mean the difference between profitable trips and expensive fuel bills with empty fish boxes. The silence from all three vessels was unprecedented in Blake's experience and suggested something had prevented normal radio communications. "I want to go out there," Tyler decided, his instincts telling him that answers wouldn't be found sitting at a desk or waiting for Coast Guard reports. "You got a boat that can handle 30, 40-mile runs in whatever conditions we might encounter?" Blake nodded toward a sturdy-looking 36-footer tied at the end of the dock, its hull showing the scars and maintenance that marked it as a working vessel rather than a pleasure craft. "The Gulf Runner. She's mine, and she'll take whatever the Gulf throws at her. Twin diesels, full electronics, enough fuel for a 100-mile round trip. But, Sheriff," Blake's expression grew troubled, "maybe we should wait for the Coast Guard, if something's out there that took 3 boats with experienced crews." Tyler understood Blake's concern, the same instinct that kept experienced fishermen alive in dangerous situations. But waiting wasn't an option. Every hour that passed reduced the chances of finding survivors if the crews were in the water. Modern survival suits and life rafts could keep people alive for days in Gulf waters, but time was still critical. How long to the nearest of their fishing grounds? Trevor's near-shore spots, maybe 45 minutes at cruise speed if we push it. Cody's ledges about an hour and 15 minutes. Dustin's deep water grounds, probably 2 hours depending on conditions. Tyler made his decision based on 23 years of experience that had taught him the value of immediate action over careful planning. "Get the Gulf Runner ready. I want to check those locations before the area gets crowded with search boats and helicopters. Sometimes the first person on scene sees things that get missed later when there are too many people looking." As Blake prepared the vessel with the efficiency of someone who'd done it thousands of times, Tyler contacted his department to coordinate the investigation. He ordered Deputy Garcia to establish communication schedules with the Coast Guard and to coordinate with county emergency services. He also requested that the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission be notified, since they had jurisdiction over commercial fishing operations and might have insights into recent changes in fishing patterns or regulations that could be relevant. The Gulf Runner proved to be a well-maintained sport fishing boat equipped with professional-grade electronics that would have cost more than Tyler's annual salary. GPS chart plotter showing underwater contours in high resolution, depth sounder capable of marking individual fish, radar system for navigation in poor visibility, and multiple radios covering every frequency used by commercial and recreational vessels. Blake had marked the last known positions of all 3 missing vessels on the electronic chart, creating a triangle of search areas that covered roughly 50 square miles of Gulf waters. They departed Cypress Cove as the sun climbed above the horizon, painting the Gulf in shades of gold and blue that reminded Tyler why he'd chosen to build his career in this part of Florida despite offers from larger departments with better pay and advancement opportunities. The water remained calm, with swells barely 2 feet and winds less than 10 knots, perfect conditions for fishing and for spotting debris or vessels in distress. Perfect conditions that made the disappearance of 3 experienced crews even more mysterious and troubling. The first destination was Trevor Wilson's near-shore territory, a series of artificial reefs and limestone ledges about 15 miles from shore, that had been developed over decades to provide fishing opportunities and habitat for marine life. These were popular fishing spots, easily accessible to smaller boats and known for producing consistent catches of snapper, grouper, and amberjack that formed the backbone of the local fishing economy. The artificial reefs were marked on charts and GPS systems, making them easy to find for anyone with basic navigation skills. Blake navigated with the confidence of someone who'd run these waters for decades, adjusting course slightly to account for current and wind drift in ways that couldn't be learned from textbooks, but had to be absorbed through years of experience. Tyler watched the depth sounder as they crossed underwater contours, the bottom rising and falling in patterns that meant nothing to him but were clearly familiar to Blake, who could read the bottom structure like a road map and predict where fish would be concentrated. "There," Blake said, pointing to a slight disturbance on the water's surface that looked like random waves to Tyler but clearly meant something to the experienced fisherman. "That's the first reef Trevor would have hit yesterday morning. Good snapper numbers here this time of year, and the amberjack have been schooling over the structure all summer." Tyler scanned the water with binoculars, looking for any sign of debris, oil slicks, or floating objects that might indicate a vessel in distress or worse. The surface appeared unmarked, except for the occasional jumping fish or clumps of floating sargassum weed that drifted north with the Gulf Stream. No life preservers, no fuel slicks, no debris that would suggest a boat had been in trouble in this area. Blake circled the area in a systematic search pattern while Tyler maintained radio contact with the Coast Guard, reporting their position and negative findings. The professional search aircraft would arrive within the hour, equipped with sophisticated detection equipment that could spot objects in the water from miles away, but Tyler's instincts told him they wouldn't find the boats in the obvious places. Something about this situation felt orchestrated rather than accidental. "Next spot," Tyler ordered, noting the time and position in his log while trying to develop theories that might explain 3 simultaneous disappearances. They visited 4 more of Trevor's regular fishing locations over the next hour, each yielding the same result: empty water under perfect fishing conditions. No signs of distress, no debris, no indication that Sweet Dreams had been in any of these areas. The absence of evidence was becoming evidence itself, suggesting that whatever had happened to these boats, it hadn't occurred during normal fishing operations at their intended destinations. "This don't make sense, Sheriff," Blake muttered as they headed toward Cody Turner's territory farther offshore, the bottom dropping away beneath them into the deep blue water that held the big pelagic fish. Even if Trevor had catastrophic engine failure or hit something, he carries top-shelf emergency equipment: EPIRBs, life raft, flares, survival suits, satellite communicator. Something should have activated. Something should have floated to the surface. Tyler agreed, understanding that modern safety equipment made it extremely difficult for vessels to simply disappear without a trace. Emergency position, indicating radio beacons automatically activated when submerged, broadcasting distress signals on satellite frequencies monitored continuously by rescue services worldwide. Life rafts deployed automatically when vessels sank, and survival suits could keep people alive in water for days. The complete absence of any distress signals suggested either catastrophic destruction of the vessels or something that had prevented the crews from deploying their safety equipment. The run to Cody's fishing grounds took them into deeper water, where the Gulf floor dropped away into the blue-black depths that held big pelagic fish: tuna, billfish, sharks, and the deep water grouper that commanded premium prices at restaurants throughout the southeast. These were the ledges Blake had mentioned, underwater cliff faces where the continental shelf fell away into the abyss, creating upwelling currents that brought nutrients to the surface and attracted the entire food chain from plankton to massive predators. "Cody likes to work the edge of the 100-fathom curve," Blake explained, pointing to contour lines on the GPS display that showed dramatic depth changes. Drop lines right where the bottom falls away from 60 feet to 600 feet in the span of maybe 200 yards. That's where the big fish cruise, following the edge and looking for bait schools that get concentrated by the current. Tyler studied the depth sounder as they approached the area, watching the bottom contours change from relatively shallow water to truly deep ocean. The ledges created upwelling currents that brought nutrients to the surface, attracting bait fish and the predators that fed on them. It was also an area where a boat could disappear into water so deep that recovery would be impossible without specialized equipment. As they neared Cody's preferred fishing spot, Blake suddenly pointed ahead with the urgency of someone who'd spotted something that didn't belong. "Sheriff, look at that. 2 o'clock, maybe quarter mile." Tyler raised his binoculars and scanned the area Blake indicated. At first he saw nothing unusual, the same endless expanse of Gulf water under the morning sun that was already beginning to build the heat and humidity that would make the afternoon miserable for anyone working outdoors. Then he spotted what Blake had seen, a small object floating on the surface, too far away to identify clearly, but obviously out of place in the empty seascape. Blake pushed the throttles forward, and the Gulf runner surged toward the floating object with the kind of acceleration that reminded Tyler these boats were built for speed as well as stability. As they drew closer, Tyler could make out details that sent a chill through him, despite the rising heat of the day that was already making his uniform stick to his back. It was a life ring from the Miss Carolyn, the orange and white ring that was required safety equipment on all commercial fishing vessels. The ring floated alone on the calm surface, showing no signs of the violent action typically associated with vessels in distress. No damage to the flotation material, no tears in the rope, no indication it had been deployed in an emergency situation where crew members were fighting for their lives. Blake maneuvered alongside the life ring while Tyler used a boat hook to pull it aboard, noting that it felt normal weight and showed no obvious damage. The ring appeared almost new despite having been in the water for at least 18 hours, which suggested it hadn't been subjected to rough handling or violent seas. Most unsettling was the way it had been floating, upright and stable, as if it had been carefully placed rather than thrown from a vessel or blown overboard by wind. "This ain't right, Sheriff," Blake said, voicing Tyler's own thoughts while examining the life ring for any clues about how it had ended up floating alone in the Gulf. If the Miss Carolyn went down, there'd be more debris. Life jackets, seat cushions, coolers, anything that floats. And there'd be fuel slicks, oil sheens, something to mark where a boat went under. Tyler keyed his radio to contact the Coast Guard. "Coast Guard Sector St. Petersburg. This is Sheriff Rodriguez. We've recovered a life ring from the Miss Carolyn at position." He read the GPS coordinates from the chart plotter. "No other debris visible in the immediate area. Continuing search of surrounding waters." The Coast Guard acknowledged and confirmed that aircraft were approaching the area from multiple directions. Tyler requested that they concentrate their search pattern around the current location, while expanding outward in systematic sweeps that would cover the maximum area in the minimum time. Blake continued circling the area where they'd found the life ring, both men scanning the water for additional signs of the missing vessel while Tyler tried to develop theories that might explain finding a single piece of safety equipment with no other debris. The life ring appeared to be the only trace of the Miss Carolyn, which violated everything Tyler knew about maritime accidents and vessel sinking patterns. "Blake," Tyler said finally, "in your experience, if a boat went down out here, what would you expect to find floating?" Blake considered the question seriously, his weathered face showing the concentration of someone drawing on decades of experience with vessels in distress. "Depends on what happened, Sheriff. Sudden sinking, like hitting something underwater, or an explosion in the engine room, you'd see debris scattered by current and wind over a wide area. Slower sinking, maybe from flooding or collision damage, the crew would have time to deploy safety equipment and send distress calls. Either way, modern boats carry enough built-in flotation that something substantial should surface even if the hull goes down." "And if a boat just disappeared?" Blake's weathered face showed confusion mixed with the kind of professional skepticism that kept experienced mariners alive. "Sheriff, boats don't just disappear. Not in calm weather with experienced crews who know these waters. Even if every single system failed at once, even if the crew made every wrong decision possible, something would float. Coast Guard regulations require enough flotation and safety equipment to keep crews alive until rescue arrives." Tyler studied the life ring again, noting that it showed no signs of violence or distress. The rope remained neatly coiled, the reflective tape unblemished, the flotation material intact. If the Miss Carolyn had been in trouble, this safety equipment should show evidence of emergency deployment: scratches, tears, salt stains, anything that indicated desperate crew members grabbing for survival gear. The radio crackled with an update from the Coast Guard. "All units, this is Coast Guard 6020. We have aircraft on station beginning systematic search pattern. Visibility unlimited, sea conditions optimal for spotting debris or personnel in water. No visual contact with any of the 3 missing vessels at this time." Tyler acknowledged and requested an expansion of the search to include Dustin Clark's deep-water fishing grounds. If the pattern held, and Tyler was beginning to suspect it would, they might find another single piece of evidence, equally mysterious and unsatisfying, that raised more questions than it answered. The run to Dustin's territory took them into truly deep water, where the Gulf floor lay over 600 feet below the surface, and the watercolor changed from emerald green to deep blue that seemed to absorb light and hold secrets. These were the grounds worked by serious offshore fishermen, targeting large grouper, snapper, and the occasional billfish that commanded premium prices at fish markets throughout the southeast. Blake navigated by GPS and depth sounder, the underwater topography invisible from the surface, but clearly defined on the sophisticated electronics that had revolutionized fishing over the past 2 decades. "Dustin likes to work this seamount," Blake explained, indicating an underwater peak on the chart display that rose from the depths to within 200 feet of the surface. "Big fish patrol the edges where the current brings bait fish up from the deep water." As they approached the area, Tyler spotted another object floating on the water's surface, this one larger than the life ring but still appearing isolated and out of place in the vast expanse of empty ocean. Blake maneuvered closer while Tyler prepared the boat hook, both men understanding without speaking that they were about to recover another piece of evidence that would deepen the mystery rather than solve it. It was a fishing rod, floating tip-up on the calm surface with its reel still attached and line still spooled. Blake maneuvered alongside while Tyler retrieved it with the boat hook, noting immediately that the rod belonged to the Marlin's Rest, according to the faded decal on the handle that identified it as part of Dustin Clark's gear. Like the life ring, the fishing rod showed no signs of violence or distress. The line was still neatly spooled on the reel, the tackle box attachment unopened, the rod itself unmarked by rough handling or emergency situations. It appeared to have been deliberately placed in the water, rather than lost during fishing operations or emergency evacuations. "This is getting spooky, Sheriff," Blake admitted, his voice carrying the unease of someone who'd spent his life on the water and understood that the ocean didn't typically leave such neat, isolated clues. "It's like somebody's leaving us breadcrumbs, leading us from one fishing ground to the next." Tyler's thoughts exactly. 2 missing boats, 2 pieces of evidence, both suggesting the vessels had been in these locations, but providing no clues about what had happened to them or their crews. The deliberate nature of the evidence placement suggested human involvement, rather than natural maritime accidents. The radio interrupted his thoughts with a transmission from the Coast Guard aircraft. "Sheriff Rodriguez, this is Coast Guard 6020. We have a visual on a floating object approximately 5 miles southwest of your current position. Coordinates follow." Blake plotted the location on the chart plotter while Tyler acknowledged the transmission. The new coordinates lay between the deep water grounds and the nearshore reefs, roughly in the center of the triangle formed by the 3 fishing areas where the boats had been scheduled to work. The run took 15 minutes through calm seas that reflected the morning sun like polished glass, and Tyler could see the Coast Guard aircraft circling above as they approached the reported location. Through binoculars, he spotted what the pilot had seen, another floating object, larger than the previous 2 but still appearing deliberately placed rather than randomly lost. As they drew closer, Tyler's stomach tightened with the familiar dread that accompanied major cases. It was a life raft, still in its deployment canister, but floating in a way that suggested it had been deliberately placed rather than automatically deployed from a sinking vessel. The raft's inflation cord remained attached to the canister, and the automatic deployment mechanism showed no signs of activation. Blake brought the Gulf Runner alongside the life raft while Tyler studied it carefully, noting details that confirmed his growing suspicions about the nature of these disappearances. The raft belonged to Sweet Dreams, according to the vessel registration numbers on the canister that were required by Coast Guard regulations. Like the other objects, it showed no signs of distress or emergency deployment. 3 boats, 3 pieces of evidence, Tyler said into his radio, reporting to the Coast Guard coordinator while his mind worked through implications that made him increasingly uncomfortable. All apparently placed deliberately. No signs of distress or emergency situations at any of the recovery locations. The Coast Guard pilot acknowledged and reported negative results from the expanded air search that was now covering over 300 square miles of Gulf waters. No other vessels, no debris fields, no emergency signals, no indication of where 3 commercial fishing boats with 8 experienced crew members had gone after leaving their home port the previous morning. Tyler made a decision that would prove crucial to the investigation's direction. Blake, I want to visit every place where commercial boats fuel up between here and Pensacola. Someone had to see these boats after they left Cypress Cove yesterday morning. Boats don't just vanish. Someone knows something. The nearest fuel dock was at Pelican Bay, a small marina about 20 miles east of Cypress Cove that served both recreational and commercial vessels along this stretch of coast. The facility provided fuel, supplies, ice, and basic mechanical services to the fishing fleet that worked the eastern part of Tyler's jurisdiction. The dockmaster, a sun-weathered man named Bryce Collins who'd worked marinas for 30 years, knew all 3 missing captains by sight and reputation. "Sure, I seen them all yesterday morning," he told Tyler without hesitation. "Came through here right around dawn. All 3 boats within maybe 20 minutes of each other. Unusual to see them all together like that." Tyler's interest sharpened like a fishhook setting. "They fuel up here regularly?" "Cody and Trevor do, maybe twice a week depending on their fishing schedule. Dustin usually tops off at the big marina in Clearwater where fuel's a few cents cheaper, but he was here yesterday too. Seemed like they were all in a hurry to get offshore. Didn't spend time socializing like they usually do." "Anything unusual about their behavior yesterday morning?" Bryce considered the question while Tyler waited, understanding that marina personnel often noticed details that seemed insignificant at the time but proved important later. "Now that you mention it, yeah. Usually those boys will chat for a few minutes when they're all here at the same time, compare notes on where the fish are biting, maybe complain about fuel prices or fishing regulations. Yesterday, they barely spoke to each other, pumped their fuel, paid cash, and took off." Tyler asked to see security footage from the fuel dock, hoping that video evidence might reveal details that Bryce had missed or forgotten. The camera system was basic but functional, covering the fuel pumps and main dock area with sufficient resolution to identify vessels and personnel. The timestamp on the footage confirmed Bryce's account, showing all 3 boats arriving between 5:30 and 5:50 a.m. in the gray pre-dawn light. Watching the footage, Tyler noticed something that struck him as significant. The 3 captains, who Blake had described as longtime friends and colleagues who'd grown up fishing these waters together, barely acknowledged each other's presence during the fueling process. Each boat fueled quickly and departed without the usual social interaction that Tyler had observed among the tight-knit fishing community during previous visits to various marinas. No waving, no shouted conversations between boats, no coordinated departures that suggested shared fishing plans or cooperative efforts. "Bryce," Tyler said, "did any of them mention where they were headed yesterday? Specific fishing grounds, planned return times? Anything like that?" "That's another thing that struck me as odd," Bryce replied, his expression showing the kind of professional concern that marina operators developed after years of worrying about the safety of vessels departing their docks. "Usually, captains will give you a general idea where they're planning to fish, near shore, offshore, north or south of here. Yesterday, none of them said a word about their plans, just fueled up and left like they were in some kind of hurry." Tyler left Pelican Bay with more questions than answers, but also with a growing conviction that the 3 missing boats had been involved in something beyond routine fishing operations. The behavior of the captains suggested coordination despite their apparent lack of communication, as if they were following a plan that required secrecy or at least discretion. The next fuel stop was Tarpon Springs, a larger facility about 40 miles north that served the area's famous sponge diving fleet as well as recreational and commercial fishing boats. The marina's size and commercial focus made it a logical stop for vessels traveling longer distances or requiring specialized services. The dockmaster there had no record of the 3 missing vessels, which wasn't surprising given their stated fishing plans and normal operating patterns. Tyler was preparing to leave when one of the fuel dock workers approached him with information that would fundamentally change the direction of the investigation. "You asking about boats that went missing yesterday?" the worker asked. He was a young man named Drew Phillips who'd been working the marina for 2 years while studying marine engineering at a local community college. "I might have seen something that could be relevant." Tyler's attention focused immediately. "What did you see?" Drew explained that he'd been working the night shift, handling late arrivals and providing security for the marina during overnight hours. Around midnight, he'd noticed 3 boats heading offshore in formation, running without navigation lights in violation of federal regulations that required vessels to display proper lighting during nighttime operations. "They was running dark," Drew explained, using the maritime term for vessels operating without lights. No navigation lights, no cabin lights, no deck lights. Just 3 boats moving together maybe half a mile offshore, heading southwest toward deep water. Tyler's pulse quickened with the excitement of a significant lead. "You sure it was 3 boats? And you could see them clearly enough to count?" "Definitely 3 boats, Sheriff. I was taking a smoke break and happened to look out at the water when I saw them. Moonlight was bright enough to see their silhouettes moving in line, maybe 100 yards apart. They was moving slow and steady, like they was following each other or maybe following GPS coordinates to a specific location." "What time was this exactly?" "Right around midnight, maybe 10 or 15 minutes after. I remember because I was thinking it was strange to see boats running without lights that time of night, especially commercial boats whose captains know better than to risk Coast Guard violations." Tyler thanked Drew and returned to the Gulf Runner with a new theory forming in his mind, one that explained the mysterious evidence they'd recovered and the unusual behavior of the 3 captains. The boats hadn't disappeared during their morning fishing trips as everyone had assumed. They had returned to shore sometime during the night, then departed again in the early hours before dawn for purposes that had nothing to do with catching fish. Blake was skeptical when Tyler shared this information during the run back towards Cypress Cove. "Why would they run dark, Sheriff? These are professional captains, not smugglers or pirates. They know federal regulations require navigation lights during nighttime operations, and why would they tell everyone they were going fishing if they had other plans?" Tyler didn't have complete answers yet, but the evidence was mounting that the 3 missing boats had been involved in activities that required secrecy and coordination. The question was, what kind of activities? and whether those activities had led directly to their disappearance and the probable deaths of 8 experienced fishermen. The investigation took a new direction when Tyler returned to Cypress Cove and discovered Blake Patterson waiting for him with additional information that had emerged from conversations with other local fishing captains. "Sheriff, I've been talking to some of the other boat owners who work out of here. Turns out Cody, Trevor, and Dustin had been acting strange for about a week before they disappeared." According to Blake, all 3 captains had been asking questions about deep water areas that weren't traditional fishing grounds. Specifically, they had been inquiring about locations where the Gulf floor was particularly deep and far from normal shipping lanes, areas where commercial and recreational traffic was minimal and Coast Guard patrols were infrequent. "Makes no sense from a fishing perspective," Blake continued, his confusion evident in his voice and expression. "These boys know every fishing spot within 50 miles of shore. They've been working these waters for decades. Why would they suddenly be interested in places where fish don't congregate and fishing would be unproductive?" Tyler's radio interrupted the conversation with an update from Deputy Garcia that would prove crucial to understanding the scope of the situation. The Coast Guard had expanded their search to cover over 500 square miles of Gulf waters with negative results. No additional debris, no emergency signals, no signs of the missing vessels or their crews. "Sheriff," Garcia continued, "we got another development that might be significant. The families of the missing crew members are asking questions about recent behavior changes. Apparently, several of the men had been making unusual financial arrangements in the past month." Tyler requested details and learned information that confirmed his growing suspicions about the nature of the disappearances. Cody Turner had recently updated his will and life insurance beneficiaries, unusual for a man in his 50s who'd never shown particular concern about estate planning. Trevor Wilson had paid off several outstanding debts using cash that bank records couldn't trace to his normal fishing income. Most significantly, Dustin Clark had deposited a substantial amount of cash in his checking account, $15,000 that had appeared without explanation in his banking records. The pattern suggested the 3 captains had been planning something that involved significant financial risk and potential profit. Tyler began to suspect the disappearance might not be accidental, but rather the result of criminal activity that had gone wrong in ways that led to violence and murder. That evening, Tyler met with the families of the missing crew members at the Cypress Cove Community Center, a gathering that was both emotionally difficult and professionally necessary. The families deserved information about the investigation's progress, but Tyler also hoped that relatives might provide insights into recent behavior changes that could explain what had happened to their loved ones. The gathering was emotional, with wives, children, parents, and siblings seeking answers that Tyler couldn't provide while struggling with their own fears about the fate of men they loved. But during the meeting, several family members mentioned strange phone calls and conversations their relatives had received in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Garrett Moore's girlfriend reported that Garrett had been excited about a big opportunity that would set him up financially for years to come. He'd been secretive about details, but had mentioned working with some people from out of state on a project that required his knowledge of local waters and fishing operations. Landon Foster's wife said he had mentioned working with businessmen from Miami who needed experienced boat crews for operations that paid substantially more than commercial fishing. He'd been reluctant to discuss specifics, but had assured her that the work was legal and would provide enough money to buy their own fishing boat. Tanner Adams's brother reported similar conversations about high-paying work that required discretion and local maritime knowledge. Tanner had mentioned that the job involved meeting other vessels offshore and transferring cargo, but he'd insisted that everything was legitimate and legal. Tyler gathered contact information and promised to investigate these leads, but he was beginning to form a theory that made his stomach churn with the implications. The evidence suggested the 3 boats had been recruited for some kind of maritime operation that required their local knowledge, experienced crews, and ability to navigate Gulf waters without attracting attention from law enforcement or regulatory agencies. The next morning brought Tyler's first major break in the case when a recreational fisherman reported finding a waterproof bag floating near the mouth of Tampa Bay, about 60 miles south of Cypress Cove. Inside the bag were navigational charts marked with locations and routes that didn't correspond to normal fishing operations or recreational boating activities. Tyler drove to Tampa Bay to examine the evidence personally, accompanied by Deputy Garcia and a federal agent from the Drug Enforcement Administration who'd been monitoring the case due to suspected connections with maritime smuggling operations. The charts showed detailed routes from various points along the Gulf Coast to coordinates far offshore, beyond the normal range of commercial fishing operations and in areas where regulatory oversight was minimal. Most interesting were notations in what appeared to be Cody Turner's handwriting, indicating specific times and locations for pickup and delivery operations. The charts also showed alternate routes and contingency plans that suggested extensive planning and coordination with other parties. The implications were becoming clear, but Tyler needed more evidence before drawing conclusions that would affect multiple ongoing investigations. He requested assistance from the DEA and Coast Guard Investigative Service, agencies with experience in maritime smuggling operations and the resources to investigate activities that crossed state and international boundaries. The joint investigation revealed that the area where the 3 boats had disappeared was along a known corridor for drug smuggling operations from South America to the U.S. Gulf Coast. The remote locations, deep water, and minimal law enforcement presence made the area attractive to criminal organizations moving large quantities of illegal drugs from source countries to distribution networks throughout the United States. The timeline that emerged from the expanded investigation fit perfectly with Tyler's theory about what had happened to the missing boats. The 3 vessels had departed Cypress Cove for legitimate fishing operations, establishing alibis and normal departure records. Sometime during the day, they had rendezvoused with a larger vessel, possibly a freighter or cargo ship, in international waters where U.S. law enforcement jurisdiction was limited. After transferring cargo from the larger vessel to their fishing boats, the 3 captains had returned to the Gulf Coast under cover of darkness, running without lights to avoid detection by Coast Guard patrols or other law enforcement agencies. They had unloaded whatever cargo they had picked up at a predetermined location, then attempted to return to the rendezvous point for reasons that remained unclear. What happened next remained a mystery, but Tyler suspected the operation had gone wrong in ways that led to violence and the destruction of all 3 boats. Either the criminal organization had decided to eliminate witnesses who could identify them to law enforcement, or competing smugglers had intercepted the boats and killed the crews to steal their cargo or eliminate competition. The carefully placed evidence, the life ring, fishing rod, and life raft, suggested someone wanted the boats to be reported missing while concealing the true nature of their disappearance. By making the disappearances appear to be maritime accidents, the perpetrators hoped to avoid the kind of intensive law enforcement investigation that would follow if the boats were known to be involved in criminal activities. Tyler's investigation expanded to include financial records, communication intercepts, and surveillance of known criminal associates who might have been involved in recruiting the 3 fishing crews. The DEA discovered that all 3 captains had recently purchased new communication equipment, encrypted radios and satellite phones, suggesting they had been recruited for operations requiring secure communications that couldn't be monitored by law enforcement agencies. Bank records revealed payments to all 3 men from accounts traced to known money laundering operations connected to South American drug cartels. The amounts were substantial enough to explain their willingness to participate in illegal activities. Each captain had received between $50,000 and $75,000 in advance payments, but also large enough to suggest the risks involved were considerable and potentially fatal. 2 weeks after the disappearance, Tyler received a call that would change the entire investigation and confirm his worst fears about the fate of the missing crews. A commercial fisherman working waters near the dry Tortugas, 70 miles west of Key West, had discovered debris that appeared to be from one of the missing boats. Tyler joined the Coast Guard recovery operation and watched as divers brought up pieces of hull, electronics, and personal effects from the Miss Carolyn. The debris lay scattered across the ocean floor in deep water, far from the boat's intended fishing grounds, and in an area that suggested deliberate disposal rather than accidental sinking. Forensic examination of the wreckage revealed evidence that would fundamentally change the nature of the investigation. The Miss Carolyn hadn't sunk accidentally due to mechanical failure, collision, or weather. The boat had been deliberately destroyed by explosives, with blast patterns suggesting the charges had been placed internally by someone familiar with the vessel's construction and structural weak points. Tyler's worst fears were confirmed when similar debris fields were located for Sweet Dreams and the Marlin's Rest over the following weeks. All 3 boats had been scuttled in deep water using explosives, their crews presumably killed to prevent them from revealing details of the smuggling operation to law enforcement agencies. The investigation that followed involved multiple federal agencies and took nearly 18 months to complete, ultimately resulting in one of the largest maritime drug smuggling prosecutions in Florida history. The evidence trail led to a South American drug cartel that had been using Gulf Coast fishing boats to transport cocaine from freighters to shore, taking advantage of the local knowledge and legitimate cover provided by experienced fishing crews. The 3 Cypress Cove captains had been recruited based on their knowledge of local waters, their financial vulnerabilities, and their ability to operate boats in a way that wouldn't attract attention from law enforcement or regulatory agencies. The recruitment had been methodical and professional, targeting men with specific skills and circumstances that made them attractive assets for criminal operations. The operation had been discovered by a rival criminal organization, leading to the violent confrontation that resulted in the boat's destruction and the crew's murders. The carefully placed evidence, the life ring, fishing rod, and life raft, had been intended to suggest accidental disappearance, while the real perpetrators escaped detection and continued their operations in other areas. Tyler testified before federal grand juries that indicted 23 individuals for drug trafficking, murder, conspiracy, and various other charges related to the operation. Most of the defendants were never brought to trial, having fled to countries without extradition treaties with the United States. The few who were captured and prosecuted received lengthy prison sentences, but justice for the 8 murdered crew members remained incomplete and unsatisfying. The case fundamentally changed Tyler's understanding of his jurisdiction and the challenges facing law enforcement in coastal areas. The quiet fishing communities he had served for decades were not immune to the violence and corruption that characterized international drug trafficking. The very remoteness that made the area attractive to law-abiding fishermen also made it valuable to criminal organizations seeking to move illegal drugs into the United States. Blake Patterson never fully recovered from the loss of his friends and colleagues, retiring from active fishing operations and selling his boats to avoid the memories associated with the tragedy. The Cypress Cove fishing community, once trusting and close-knit, became suspicious and guarded as residents realized that their neighbors and friends had been recruited by criminal organizations willing to kill to protect their operations. Tyler implemented new protocols for monitoring unusual maritime activity in his jurisdiction, working with federal agencies to establish better communication and coordination systems. The county established a Marine Patrol unit with authority to investigate suspicious vessel movements and coordinate with federal agencies investigating smuggling operations. Regular meetings with local fishing captains provided early warning systems for recruitment attempts by criminal organizations, and Tyler established procedures for reporting suspicious contacts or offers that seemed too good to be true. The fishing community learned to be skeptical of strangers offering easy money for maritime services, understanding that such offers often came with deadly consequences. 5 years after the disappearance, Tyler received a call from a federal prosecutor involved in the original case. New evidence had emerged suggesting the criminal organization responsible for the murders was still operating in Gulf waters, using refined versions of the same recruitment methods that had led to the Cypress Cove tragedy. Tyler shared this information with current fishing captains, warning them about the tactics used to identify and recruit local mariners for illegal operations. The warning proved timely when 2 captains reported being approached by individuals offering substantial payments for special fishing trips to coordinates far from normal fishing grounds. The approaches followed the same pattern that had ensnared the original victims: initial contact through intermediaries, gradual escalation of commitments, substantial advance payments, and requirements for secrecy that should have been warning signs. Tyler's warnings helped the captains recognize the recruitment attempts and report them to federal authorities. The Cypress Cove Marina still operates as a working fishing port, but 3 slips remain permanently empty as a memorial to the Miss Carolyn, Sweet Dreams, and Marlin's Rest. A plaque near the fuel dock warns visiting mariners to report any unusual requests for maritime services and provides contact information for federal agencies investigating smuggling operations. Tyler often stands at the end of the main dock during his evening patrols, looking out over Gulf waters that appear peaceful and inviting under the Florida sun. But he knows that beneath the surface, beauty lie depths that conceal violence, greed, and the remains of 8 men who paid the ultimate price for trusting people who viewed human life as an acceptable cost of doing business. The fishing village of Cypress Cove learned that even the most isolated communities are not beyond the reach of international crime. The Gulf waters that had provided sustenance and livelihood for generations also served as highways for those who traffic in drugs, violence, and death. The lesson was hard-learned and expensive, costing 8 lives and the innocence of a community that had trusted in the fundamental decency of human nature. For Tyler Rodriguez, the case served as a permanent reminder that in law enforcement, the most dangerous threats often appear in the most innocent disguises. The friendly stranger offering easy money, the businessman with legitimate-seeming credentials, the opportunity that seems too good to be true, all potential doorways to violence and tragedy that law enforcement officers must learn to recognize and investigate before they claim more victims. The Gulf keeps its secrets well, Tyler reflects as he watches fishing boats return from their daily trips loaded with legitimate catches earned through honest work and family traditions passed down through generations of hard-working people who understand the risks and rewards of making their living from the sea. Some secrets stay buried forever in the deep water beyond the continental shelf, where currents and time erase evidence and scatter debris across thousands of square miles of ocean floor that will never give up what it has claimed. Others surface unexpectedly, carried by currents and tides to beaches where they serve as warnings to those wise enough to heed them and learn from the mistakes of others who trusted too easily and paid too dearly. The investigation's aftermath revealed additional disturbing details about the scope of the criminal organization's operations along the Gulf Coast. Federal agencies discovered that the Cypress Cove recruitment had been part of a larger pattern targeting fishing communities from Texas to the Florida Keys, exploiting the economic vulnerabilities of commercial fishermen who were struggling with rising fuel costs, declining fish populations, and increased regulatory pressure that made legitimate fishing operations increasingly difficult to sustain profitably. The criminal organization had developed sophisticated methods for identifying potential recruits, using local informants to assess the financial situations, family obligations, and character weaknesses of experienced boat captains and crew members. They targeted men with outstanding debts, medical expenses, or other financial pressures that made them susceptible to offers of easy money that seemed to provide solutions to their problems. The recruitment process was carefully designed to minimize suspicion and maximize compliance. Initial contact came through intermediaries who appeared to be legitimate businessmen, offering legal transportation services for wealthy clients who valued privacy and discretion. The work was presented as high-end charter services for individuals who preferred to avoid commercial airports and tourist facilities, a story that seemed plausible to fishermen familiar with the eccentricities of wealthy boat owners. Payments were structured to create financial dependence while maintaining plausible explanations for sudden increases in income. Captains received retainers for being available on short notice, bonuses for successful trips, and equipment allowances that helped them justify their participation to suspicious family members or community observers. The money was significant enough to improve their quality of life noticeably, but not so large as to attract unwanted attention from law enforcement or regulatory agencies. The criminal organization's operational security was sophisticated, involving encrypted communications, coded language, and compartmentalized information that prevented recruits from understanding the full scope of their involvement in illegal activities. Each captain knew only what was necessary for his specific role, and contact with the organization was limited to a single handler who maintained strict operational discipline and security protocols. Tyler's investigation revealed that the 3 Cypress Cove captains had been unaware of each other's involvement until shortly before their final trip, when operational requirements forced the organization to coordinate their activities in ways that increased their vulnerability to detection and elimination. The decision to use multiple boats from the same community had been driven by logistical requirements that ultimately proved fatal to all involved. The organization's decision to eliminate the 3 crews had been based on cold calculations about operational security and risk management. The captains had begun asking questions about their assignments, expressing concerns about the legality of their activities, and making demands for additional compensation that suggested they were becoming security risks who might cooperate with law enforcement if captured or investigated. The murders had been carried out by a specialized crew that followed the boats to the rendezvous point, eliminated the crews during what appeared to be a normal cargo transfer, then destroyed the vessels using explosives designed to scatter debris over a wide area and make forensic investigation difficult. The careful placement of evidence near their intended fishing grounds had been intended to support the cover story of accidental disappearance during normal fishing operations. Tyler learned that similar eliminations had occurred in other Gulf Coast communities, where recruited fishermen had become security risks or operational liabilities. The criminal organization treated human life as just another business expense, eliminating threats to their operations with the same cold efficiency they applied to other aspects of their smuggling activities. The federal investigation eventually identified the organization as a sophisticated network with connections to South American drug cartels, corrupt officials in multiple countries, and distribution networks throughout the southeastern United States. The operation moved hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cocaine annually, using a combination of legitimate businesses, corrupted officials, and recruited local assets to maintain their activities while avoiding law enforcement detection. The investigation's scope expanded to include financial institutions that had processed money laundering operations, marine supply companies that had provided equipment to the criminal organization, and communication service providers that had facilitated encrypted communications between operatives. The complexity of the investigation required coordination between multiple federal agencies, international law enforcement organizations, and financial regulatory authorities. Tyler's role in the federal investigation expanded beyond his original jurisdiction as investigators recognized his intimate knowledge of Gulf Coast fishing communities and his ability to identify suspicious activities that might indicate ongoing recruitment efforts. He became a liaison between federal agencies and local law enforcement departments throughout the region, helping to develop protocols for recognizing and investigating criminal recruitment activities. The training programs Tyler developed became models for other coastal law enforcement agencies facing similar threats from maritime criminal organizations. The programs emphasized the importance of understanding local fishing communities, recognizing signs of recruitment activities, and maintaining communication networks that could provide early warning of suspicious approaches to potential recruits. Tyler's work with federal agencies also revealed the international scope of maritime drug trafficking and the sophisticated methods used by criminal organizations to exploit legitimate maritime activities for illegal purposes. The criminals' ability to blend their operations with normal shipping, fishing, and recreational boating activities made detection extremely difficult without specialized knowledge and coordinated investigation efforts. The case's impact on the Cypress Cove community extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of losing 8 respected community members. The revelation that trusted neighbors and friends had been recruited by criminal organizations created lasting suspicion and mistrust that affected relationships throughout the fishing community for years afterward. Families of the victims struggled with complex emotions about their loved ones' involvement in illegal activities, even though evidence suggested the men had been manipulated and ultimately murdered when they became liabilities to the criminal organization. The community grappled with questions about how well they had really known people they had trusted and worked alongside for decades. The economic impact on the local fishing industry was substantial, as potential customers and business partners became wary of associations with a community that had been penetrated by criminal organizations. Charter fishing businesses experienced declining bookings, and commercial fishing operations faced increased scrutiny from regulatory agencies and law enforcement organizations. Tyler worked with community leaders to develop rehabilitation programs that would restore confidence in the local fishing industry while maintaining vigilance against future criminal recruitment efforts. The programs included enhanced background screening for new community members, regular law enforcement briefings for fishing industry workers, and improved coordination with federal agencies monitoring maritime criminal activities. The establishment of the Marine Patrol Unit proved to be one of Tyler's most significant contributions to preventing future tragedies. The unit's officers received specialized training in recognizing suspicious maritime activities, coordinating with federal agencies, and investigating potential criminal recruitment efforts before they could claim additional victims. The Marine Patrol Unit's activities included regular surveillance of known smuggling corridors, monitoring of unusual vessel movements in county waters, and liaison work with federal agencies investigating international criminal organizations. The unit's presence served as both a deterrent to criminal activities and a source of intelligence about potential threats to local communities. Tyler's relationship with the surviving members of the fishing community required careful rebuilding of trust that had been damaged by the revelation that criminal organizations had successfully penetrated their close-knit society. Many residents felt betrayed by their inability to recognize the recruitment activities that had led to the deaths of 8 community members. The healing process involved regular community meetings where Tyler shared information about ongoing law enforcement efforts and listened to concerns about community safety and security. These meetings helped restore confidence in law enforcement while maintaining awareness of potential threats that could affect the community in the future. Tyler also worked with families of the victims to ensure they received appropriate support and compensation for their losses, navigating complex federal programs designed to assist victims of criminal activities. The process was often frustrating and bureaucratic, but Tyler's advocacy helped families access resources they needed to rebuild their lives after their devastating losses. The memorial services for the 8 victims became annual community events that honored their memory, while serving as reminders of the importance of vigilance against criminal organizations that prey on vulnerable communities. The services brought together law enforcement officials, community leaders, and family members in a shared commitment to preventing future tragedies. Tyler's personal relationship with the case evolved over the years from professional investigation to personal mission. The 3 life preservers in his office became symbols not just of the victims' deaths, but of his commitment to protecting other communities from similar tragedies through improved law enforcement coordination and community awareness programs. The case file, eventually comprising thousands of pages of reports, witness statements, evidence analyses, and coordination records, became a reference document for law enforcement agencies throughout the Gulf Coast region. Tyler's meticulous documentation of the investigation provided a template for other agencies facing similar challenges from maritime criminal organizations. The federal prosecution of the criminal organization members who were successfully captured and extradited provided some measure of justice for the victims' families. But Tyler remained frustrated by the number of high-level operatives who escaped prosecution by fleeing to countries without extradition treaties with the United States. The ongoing threat posed by similar criminal organizations required Tyler to maintain constant vigilance and coordination with federal agencies monitoring maritime criminal activities. His jurisdiction remained attractive to criminal organizations seeking to exploit local maritime knowledge and resources for illegal activities. Tyler's expertise in maritime criminal investigations led to requests for assistance from law enforcement agencies in other coastal states facing similar challenges. His willingness to share knowledge and resources helped develop a network of specialized investigators capable of recognizing and responding to maritime criminal activities before they could claim additional victims. The lessons learned from the Cypress Cove investigation became incorporated into law enforcement training programs throughout the southeastern United States. Tyler's emphasis on understanding local communities, recognizing recruitment patterns, and maintaining federal coordination became standard elements of maritime law enforcement education. The 3 life preservers that Tyler keeps in his office, recovered from the debris fields of the destroyed boats, serve as daily reminders of the 8 men who discovered too late that some opportunities come with a price higher than anyone should be asked to pay. They remind him that law enforcement in coastal communities requires constant vigilance against threats that arrive by sea as well as land, and that criminals will always seek to exploit the knowledge, skills, and vulnerabilities of local residents for their own deadly purposes. But the life preservers also represent Tyler's commitment to ensuring that the deaths of Cody Turner, Garrett Moore, Trevor Wilson, Landon Foster, Dustin Clark, and Tanner Adams were not in vain. Their sacrifice led to improved law enforcement coordination, enhanced community awareness, and better protection for other fishing communities that might otherwise fall victim to similar criminal recruitment efforts. The Gulf waters off Cypress Cove continue to provide livelihood for legitimate fishing operations, but they also serve as a reminder that beneath the surface beauty of coastal Florida lie dangers that extend far beyond natural hazards like storms and rough seas. The greatest threats often come from those who appear most helpful, offering solutions to problems that seem too good to be true and ultimately prove to be exactly that. Tyler Rodriguez continues to serve as sheriff of Suncrest County, but his role has expanded to include regional coordination of maritime security efforts and consultation with federal agencies investigating international criminal organizations. His office overlooks the Gulf waters where 8 good men lost their lives to criminal greed, and where Tyler maintains his daily vigil against those who would exploit the honest work and trust of coastal communities for their own deadly profit. The years following the Cypress Cove investigation brought Tyler into contact with similar cases throughout the Gulf Coast region, each involving the systematic exploitation of coastal communities by sophisticated criminal organizations. The pattern was always similar: identify vulnerable individuals with valuable skills, exploit their financial pressures, gradually increase their involvement in illegal activities, then eliminate them when they became security risks. Tyler's expertise became sought after by law enforcement agencies from Texas to the Florida Keys, all dealing with variations of the same problem. In Louisiana, shrimp boat captains had been recruited to transport drugs from offshore platforms. In Alabama, charter boat operators had been used to move money and weapons for criminal organizations. In Mississippi, commercial fishermen had been recruited to provide transportation for high-level criminal operatives seeking to avoid detection by federal agencies. Each case revealed new aspects of the criminal organization's sophistication and their ability to adapt to local conditions and opportunities. They studied coastal communities with the thoroughness of academic researchers, identifying economic vulnerabilities, social dynamics, and law enforcement capabilities that could be exploited for their operations. The criminal organization's recruitment methods evolved constantly, incorporating new technologies and adapting to law enforcement countermeasures. They used social media to identify potential recruits, electronic surveillance to assess targets' vulnerabilities, and sophisticated financial instruments to hide payments and maintain operational security. Tyler worked with federal agencies to develop predictive models that could identify communities at risk for criminal recruitment activities. The models incorporated economic indicators, demographic factors, and historical patterns of criminal activity to help law enforcement agencies focus their prevention efforts on the most vulnerable areas. The development of these predictive capabilities required Tyler to become familiar with aspects of criminal psychology and organizational behavior that extended far beyond traditional law enforcement training. He studied how criminal organizations identified and exploited human weaknesses, how they maintained operational security while managing large numbers of recruits, and how they adapted to law enforcement pressure. Tyler's work with psychologists and criminologists revealed disturbing insights into the criminal organization's understanding of human nature and their ability to manipulate people's fundamental needs for financial security, social acceptance, and personal dignity. The criminals were experts at identifying individuals who felt marginalized or undervalued by legitimate society and offering them opportunities to feel important and successful. The recruitment process typically began with careful observation of potential targets over periods of months or even years. Criminal operatives would establish themselves in communities as legitimate businessmen, customers, or service providers, gradually building relationships and gathering intelligence about residents' financial situations, family obligations, and personal vulnerabilities. The initial approach was always subtle and seemingly innocent, often involving offers of legitimate work that paid slightly better than normal rates. Only after targets had demonstrated reliability and discretion would the work gradually shift toward activities that skirted the edges of legality, with each step designed to increase the recruit's financial dependence and emotional investment in the relationship. Tyler learned that the criminal organizations maintained detailed psychological profiles of their recruits, tracking their emotional states, financial situations, and potential security risks. They employed specialists in human psychology who could predict how individuals would respond to various pressures and incentives, allowing them to maintain control over large networks of recruits while minimizing security risks. The organization's elimination protocols were equally sophisticated, involving careful planning and execution that minimized the risk of detection while sending clear messages to other recruits about the consequences of betrayal or security breaches. The murders were designed to appear accidental or to implicate rival criminal organizations, deflecting attention from the perpetrators. Tyler's investigation into these elimination protocols revealed that the Cypress Cove murders had been carried out by a specialized team that operated throughout the Gulf Coast region, eliminating security risks for multiple criminal organizations. The team's methods were consistent across different cases, suggesting extensive training and experience in maritime homicides. The federal investigation eventually identified several members of this elimination team, though most remained beyond the reach of U.S. law enforcement due to their base of operations in countries without extradition treaties. The few team members who were captured provided limited intelligence due to their compartmentalized knowledge and the criminal organization's sophisticated operational security. Tyler's work with international law enforcement agencies revealed the global scope of the criminal networks that had affected his jurisdiction. The organizations operated across multiple continents, using legitimate businesses and corrupted officials to move drugs, money, and personnel through complex international networks that were extremely difficult to detect and disrupt. The investigation's international aspects required Tyler to work with agencies and officials whose methods and priorities often differed significantly from American law enforcement practices. Cultural differences, legal systems, and political considerations all affected the investigation's progress and the likelihood of achieving justice for the victims. Tyler found the international coordination aspects of the investigation both fascinating and frustrating. The criminals' ability to exploit differences between national legal systems and law enforcement capabilities gave them significant advantages that were difficult to counter through traditional investigative methods. The development of international cooperation protocols became one of Tyler's specialties, as he worked with federal agencies to establish communication and coordination procedures that could overcome bureaucratic obstacles and cultural differences. His practical experience with maritime investigations made him valuable in developing procedures that could be implemented by law enforcement agencies with varying resources and capabilities. Tyler's reputation as an expert in maritime criminal investigations led to invitations to speak at law enforcement conferences throughout the United States and internationally. His presentations emphasized the importance of understanding local communities, recognizing criminal recruitment patterns, and maintaining effective coordination between different levels of law enforcement. The conferences provided Tyler with opportunities to learn about similar cases and investigative techniques from law enforcement officials around the world. He discovered that maritime criminal organizations were using similar methods in coastal communities on every continent, suggesting a level of coordination and communication that extended far beyond what he had initially imagined. Tyler's international contacts proved valuable in developing early warning systems that could alert coastal law enforcement agencies to criminal operatives who had moved from one jurisdiction to another. The systems relied on shared intelligence about recruitment methods, operational patterns, and individual operatives who posed threats to multiple communities. The establishment of these early warning systems required Tyler to navigate complex legal and political issues related to information sharing between different countries and law enforcement agencies. Privacy laws, national security considerations, and diplomatic protocols all affected what information could be shared and how it could be used in investigations. Tyler's work in developing international cooperation protocols eventually led to his appointment as a liaison officer for several federal agencies investigating transnational criminal organizations. The position required him to travel frequently to other countries and coordinate with foreign law enforcement officials on cases that affected multiple jurisdictions. The liaison work provided Tyler with insights into the criminal organization's global operations and their methods for exploiting differences between national legal systems. He learned that the organizations maintained sophisticated intelligence networks that tracked law enforcement activities and adjusted their operations to avoid detection and prosecution. Tyler's understanding of the criminal organization's capabilities and methods made him increasingly concerned about the security of his own community and family. He implemented enhanced security measures for his residence and office, varied his daily routines, and maintained constant awareness of potential surveillance or threats from criminal operatives seeking revenge for his investigative work. The security precautions became a permanent part of Tyler's life, affecting his relationships with family members and friends who struggled to understand the ongoing nature of the threats he faced. The criminal organizations demonstrated willingness to eliminate perceived threats meant that Tyler could never completely relax his guard or assume that the danger had passed. Tyler's family relationships required careful management to balance security concerns with the normal activities and relationships that made life meaningful. His wife and children learned to accept security procedures as routine parts of their lives, but the constant awareness of potential danger affected their ability to enjoy the kind of spontaneous activities that other families took for granted. The personal costs of Tyler's involvement in the investigation extended beyond security concerns to include the psychological burden of knowing about the criminal organization's capabilities and their willingness to target innocent people. The knowledge that sophisticated criminal networks were constantly seeking to exploit vulnerable communities created a sense of ongoing responsibility that affected every aspect of his law enforcement work. Tyler's commitment to preventing future tragedies like the Cypress Cove murders required constant vigilance and continuous updating of his knowledge about criminal methods and law enforcement countermeasures. The criminals' ability to adapt and evolve meant that law enforcement agencies had to constantly develop new techniques and procedures to maintain their effectiveness. The training programs Tyler developed for coastal law enforcement agencies became models that were adopted throughout the United States and internationally. The programs emphasized practical skills and knowledge that could be immediately applied by officers working in coastal communities, rather than theoretical concepts that had limited real-world applicability. Tyler's training programs included modules on recognizing recruitment activities, understanding criminal organizational structures, coordinating with federal agencies, and protecting potential victims from criminal exploitation. The programs were designed to be adaptable to different local conditions and law enforcement capabilities. The success of Tyler's training programs led to requests for his expertise from law enforcement agencies in other regions facing different types of organized criminal activities. His methods for understanding criminal recruitment patterns and developing community-based prevention strategies proved applicable to a wide range of criminal threats beyond maritime smuggling operations. Tyler's expanded role in law enforcement training and coordination required him to balance his responsibilities to Suncrest County with his growing involvement in regional and national security issues. The balance was often difficult to maintain, as the demands of his expanded role sometimes conflicted with his primary obligation to serve the residents of his jurisdiction. The residents of Suncrest County took pride in their sheriff's national recognition and expertise, but they also wanted to ensure that his expanded responsibilities didn't compromise his availability and attention to local law enforcement needs. Tyler worked carefully to maintain his connection to the community while fulfilling his broader responsibilities. Tyler's office walls now display certificates and awards from law enforcement organizations throughout the United States and internationally, recognizing his contributions to maritime security and criminal investigation techniques. But the most prominent display remains the 3 life preservers from the destroyed fishing boats, serving as daily reminders of the human cost of criminal activity and the importance of his ongoing work. The life preservers have become symbols not just of the 8 men who died, but of Tyler's commitment to preventing similar tragedies through improved law enforcement coordination, community awareness, and international cooperation. They represent both the personal loss that motivated his expanded involvement in criminal investigation and the professional success that has made him a respected expert in maritime law enforcement. Tyler's reflection on the Cypress Cove case often focuses on the lessons learned about the importance of community awareness and the need for constant vigilance against criminal exploitation. The case demonstrated that even the most close-knit communities can be penetrated by sophisticated criminal organizations, and that prevention requires ongoing effort and coordination between law enforcement agencies and community members. The investigation's legacy extends far beyond the immediate impact on Suncrest County to include improved law enforcement capabilities throughout the Gulf Coast region and beyond. Tyler's work has helped prevent similar tragedies in other communities and has contributed to the development of more effective methods for combating transnational criminal organizations. But Tyler knows that the work is never finished, that criminal organizations continue to evolve and adapt, and that new threats are constantly emerging that require continued vigilance and innovation from law enforcement agencies. The Gulf waters off Cypress Cove continue to hold their secrets, and Tyler continues to watch for signs of those who would exploit the honest work and trust of coastal communities for their own deadly purposes. The The 8 men who died in the service of criminal greed would be proud to know that their deaths led to improvements in law enforcement that have saved other lives and protected other communities. Their sacrifice was not in vain, but it serves as a permanent reminder that the price of freedom and security is eternal vigilance against those who would exploit human weakness and community trust for criminal profit. Tyler Rodriguez remains at his post, watching over the Gulf waters and the communities that depend on them for their livelihood, knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon, other criminal organizations are planning their next operations and seeking their next victims. But now, thanks to the lessons learned from the Cypress Cove tragedy, those communities are better prepared to recognize and resist criminal recruitment efforts, and law enforcement agencies are better equipped to investigate and prosecute those who would prey upon the innocent and vulnerable. The call came through dispatch at 2:17 p.m. on a suffocating July afternoon when the Florida heat made the asphalt shimmer like water, and even the Spanish moss hung motionless in the dead air that pressed down on Manatee County like a wet blanket soaked in misery. Sheriff Brandon Mitchell had been reviewing budget reports in his air-conditioned office, trying to figure out how to stretch the department's resources through another fiscal year of declining revenues and increasing demands, when Deputy Jordan Brooks's voice crackled through the radio with the kind of tension that made Brandon's coffee taste bitter and his stomach clench with the familiar dread that preceded every major case of his career. "Sheriff, we got a situation at the old Wonderland Springs theme park. Maintenance crew found something in the haunted castle ride that you need to see personally. They're pretty shaken up about it, and I mean really shaken. These guys have seen everything, but whatever's in there has them spooked bad." Brandon knew Wonderland Springs well. Everyone in Manatee County did, though most tried not to think about it too much. The abandoned theme park had been a scar on the landscape for 12 years now, ever since Hurricane Delilah had torn through central Florida and given the struggling park's owners the excuse they needed to declare bankruptcy and walk away from what had become a financial nightmare that was bleeding money faster than a severed artery. At 46, Brandon had been sheriff of Manatee County for 9 years, and he'd served as a deputy for 13 years before that, working his way up through the ranks by handling the cases that other officers found too disturbing or too complicated to pursue with the kind of methodical persistence that justice required. He'd grown up 20 miles from Wonderland Springs, had taken his first date there when he was 16 and nervous about holding hands, had brought his own kids there before the place went under, and took with it a piece of his own childhood innocence. Like thousands of other Central Florida families, the Mitchells had memories tied up in those rusted rides and overgrown walkways. Brandon could still remember the excitement of summer visits, the way his heart would pound as they approached the entrance gates, the smell of cotton candy and funnel cakes that made everything seem magical and possible. Those had been simpler times, before he'd learned what kinds of monsters could hide behind employee uniforms and friendly smiles. But Wonderland Springs had been more than just another failed theme park that couldn't compete with Disney World and Universal Studios. In its final years of operation, the place had developed a reputation that made parents nervous and kept attendance numbers declining steadily, despite increasingly desperate marketing campaigns and discount promotions. Too many incidents that management had tried to cover up. Too many children who came home with stories that didn't quite make sense. Too many families who visited once and never returned. Brandon had investigated 3 separate incidents at Wonderland Springs during his time as a deputy, cases that had never been solved but had left him with an uneasy feeling about the place that lingered long after the files were closed and filed away in storage. A 7-year-old girl named Emma Caldwell, who claimed a maintenance worker had tried to lure her away from her parents near the kiddie rides with promises of seeing baby animals that weren't part of any official attraction. A teenage boy named Marcus Thompson who reported being followed through the haunted castle by someone who wasn't part of the attraction. someone who had whispered things to him that had nothing to do with manufactured scares. A mother named Patricia Fernandez, who swore she'd seen her 4-year-old daughter talking to a man in employee clothing who disappeared when she approached, leaving her daughter confused and unable to explain what the man had been asking her about. Each incident had been investigated thoroughly, with Brandon interviewing witnesses, reviewing security footage, and coordinating with park management. But the evidence was always frustratingly thin and inconclusive. Security cameras had mysterious malfunctions during crucial time periods. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts that didn't add up to coherent narratives, and the park's management was more concerned about liability and bad publicity than cooperation with law enforcement. The investigations had gone nowhere, officially classified as unfounded or unsubstantiated, but they'd left Brandon with suspicions that something wasn't right at Wonderland Springs. The pattern had been too consistent, too specific to dismiss as coincidence or childhood imagination. Children talking about the nice man who asked them questions about their families, their daily routines, their favorite places to play. Parents reporting their kids seemed nervous or withdrawn after visits to certain areas of the park, particularly the more isolated attractions where crowds were thinner and supervision was minimal. Staff members who couldn't account for their whereabouts during key time periods, or who gave explanations that didn't match security logs or witness statements. Brandon had kept unofficial files on these incidents, documenting patterns and connections that might not have been apparent to investigators looking at individual cases in isolation. He'd noted that most of the concerning incidents occurred during weekday visits when the park was less crowded, and that they clustered around attractions that featured extended periods in dark or enclosed spaces where children might be separated from parents or guardian supervision. Those old cases came flooding back as Brandon drove through the midday heat toward the abandoned park. Memories of frustrated investigations and unanswered questions that had haunted him for years. He'd always suspected there was more to those incidents than simple misunderstandings or childhood imagination, but without solid evidence or willing cooperation from park management, his hands had been tied. Now, 12 years after the park's closure, something had been found in the ruins that was significant enough to rattle an experienced maintenance crew. The drive to Wonderland Springs took him through the kind of central Florida landscape that tourists never saw. Endless stretches of palmetto scrub broken by abandoned citrus groves that had been decimated by disease and development pressure. Roadside attractions that had been failing since the interstate bypassed them in the 1980s. And mobile home parks where retirees on fixed incomes tried to stretch their dollars in a state that was becoming increasingly expensive for anyone who wasn't wealthy. The heat made everything look flat and lifeless, like a photograph left too long in the sun until the colors faded and the details blurred into an indistinct haze. Brandon's cruiser's air conditioning struggled against the oppressive humidity that seemed to seep through every seal and gap, and he could feel sweat beginning to gather under his uniform, despite the artificial coolness of the vehicle's interior. As Brandon drove, his mind drifted back to his own childhood memories of the park, trying to reconcile the innocent excitement he remembered with the knowledge of what might have been happening behind the scenes during those family visits. He remembered the thrill of the roller coaster, the way his younger sister Sarah would cling to his arm during the scary parts of the haunted castle, the sense of adventure that came with exploring a place designed specifically to create wonder and excitement. But now those memories were complicated by adult knowledge of how predators operated, how they used legitimate venues to gain access to children, how they exploited the trust and inattention that were natural parts of family recreation. Brandon wondered how many other families had visited Wonderland Springs carrying away more than just happy memories. How many children had encountered something that would affect them for years, without their parents ever knowing. Wonderland Springs had been built in 1987 during Florida's theme park boom, when developers throughout the state thought there was room for unlimited competition with the major attractions that were drawing millions of visitors annually. the park had been designed as a more intimate, family-friendly alternative to the massive corporate parks, with attractions that emphasized storytelling and character interaction over high-tech thrills and spectacular special effects. The park had never found its niche in the competitive Florida tourism market, trying to appeal to everyone and ultimately satisfying no one completely. Too scary for small children, with its emphasis on traditional fairy tale themes that included genuinely frightening elements. Too childish for teenagers looking for adrenaline-pumping thrills. Too expensive for families seeking bargain entertainment in a state full of free beaches and natural attractions. Financial problems had plagued Wonderland Springs almost from its opening day, as attendance figures consistently fell short of optimistic projections and operating costs proved higher than expected. The park had changed ownership 3 times during its 20-year operational period, with each new management team promising improvements and innovations that never quite materialized or attracted the crowds necessary for profitability. The entrance gate stood open as Brandon approached, its cheerful facade now weathered and graffitied beyond recognition by 12 years of abandonment and neglect. What had once been bright primary colors designed to evoke excitement and anticipation had faded to pastels that looked sickly in the harsh afternoon sun. Weeds grew through cracks in the parking lot where families had once gathered with anticipation and excitement, and the ticket booths were missing their windows and doors, gutted by vandals or salvage operations. Spanish moss draped the entrance archway like funeral bunting, and the silence was broken only by the distant hum of highway traffic and the occasional call of a crow or the rustle of small animals that had claimed the ruins as their territory. The absence of human voices, the laughter of children, the chatter of families, the mechanical sounds of operating rides, made the place feel genuinely haunted in ways its designers had never intended. Brandon's cruiser crunched across broken asphalt toward the maintenance area where Deputy Brooks had said the crew was waiting, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet that surrounded the abandoned attractions. As he drove deeper into the park, he could see the skeletal remains of rides that had once thrilled thousands of visitors, now standing like monuments to failed dreams and faded aspirations. The roller coaster's track was bent and twisted from hurricane damage, its support pillars rising from the undergrowth like the ribs of some prehistoric beast that had died and been left to rot in the Florida heat. What had once been painted in bright blues and yellows to suggest speed and excitement now showed rust stains and structural damage that made it look genuinely menacing rather than thrilling. The teacup ride sat frozen mid-spin, its colorful cups faded to pastels by years of Florida sun and weather exposure. The carousel horses stood like sentinels, their painted eyes staring blindly across the abandoned midway where grass pushed up through concrete and vines reclaimed what man had built with such optimism and ambition. Nature was slowly erasing the evidence of human dreams and failures, returning the land to the wild state it had been before developers arrived with their plans and promises. Each abandoned attraction told a story of hopes that had been crushed by economic reality and changing consumer preferences. The Ferris wheel leaned at a dangerous angle, its cars hanging like broken teeth from a damaged jaw. The funhouse mirrors lay shattered on the ground, reflecting nothing but scattered fragments of sky and vegetation. The game booths where children had won stuffed animals and prizes stood empty, their colorful banners reduced to tattered strips that fluttered in the humid breeze like prayer flags in an abandoned temple. Manatee County had purchased the property 3 years ago with ambitious plans to redevelop it as a recreational vehicle park that would serve the growing population of retirees seeking affordable winter accommodations in Florida. But environmental studies had revealed contamination issues from decades of improper waste disposal that made development prohibitively expensive, and the project had been shelved indefinitely while county officials tried to figure out what to do with the white elephant they'd acquired. The county had settled for minimal maintenance to prevent the site from becoming a complete hazard to trespassers and vandals, which meant periodic inspections by work crews who checked for structural damage and basic security to keep thrill seekers and urban explorers from getting themselves killed in the ruins. It was dangerous work that required careful attention to safety procedures, as 12 years of abandonment had made even sturdy structures unreliable and potentially lethal. Deputy Brooks was waiting near the maintenance shed with 3 members of the county work crew, their faces showing the particular strain that came from encountering something that challenged their understanding of normal human behavior. Brooks was a solid officer with 10 years of experience, 10 years younger than Brandon, but experienced enough to know when something required the sheriff's personal attention rather than routine processing. "What do we have, Jordan?" Brandon asked, noting that the maintenance workers were staying close together in the kind of unconscious grouping that people adopted when they felt threatened by something they couldn't identify or understand. Their body language suggested they'd encountered something that had fundamentally disturbed their sense of how the world was supposed to work. Crew was doing their monthly safety inspection of the buildings, Brooks explained, consulting his notebook with the methodical approach that had made him one of Brandon's most reliable deputies. Checking for structural damage, new break-ins, signs of drug use or vandalism, that kind of thing. When they got to the haunted castle, they found evidence that someone's been living in there. Not just camping out like we sometimes see with homeless people, living there, like it was a permanent residence. The haunted castle had been Wonderland Springs' signature attraction, an elaborate walk-through experience that combined animatronic figures, live actors, and special effects to create what the marketing materials had called a journey through mankind's deepest fears. The building was substantial, designed to look like a medieval fortress with towers, battlements, and a working drawbridge that had long since been chained in the closed position after hurricane damage made it unsafe to operate. Brandon remembered the attraction from his childhood visits and from his later investigations as a deputy. The elaborate corridors that twisted and turned to disorient visitors, creating a sense of being lost in a genuine maze. The sudden scares that made everyone scream and laugh, carefully timed to create maximum impact without causing genuine trauma. The way the actors would stay in character even when dealing with genuinely frightened children, maintaining the illusion that made the experience memorable. It had been impressive when it was operating, with sophisticated lighting and sound effects that created an atmosphere of genuine dread and supernatural menace. But Brandon imagined it would be genuinely terrifying in its current abandoned state, with the special effects silent and the elaborate sets decaying in the Florida humidity and heat. "Living there how long?" Brandon asked, already suspecting that the answer would complicate what should have been a simple trespassing case into something that would require extensive investigation and coordination with other agencies. "That's the thing, Sheriff," said the crew supervisor, a weathered man named Trevor Wilson, who'd worked county maintenance for 15 years and had seen everything from drug labs in abandoned buildings to homeless camps and storm drains. "Based on what we found in there, somebody's been using that place as a home for years, maybe since right after the park closed. There's furniture, personal belongings, modifications to the building's electrical and plumbing systems. Whoever was living there put a lot of work into making it livable." Brandon felt the familiar tightness in his chest that preceded complex investigations, the sensation that told him he was looking at something that would consume weeks or months of his time and probably involve coordination with state and federal agencies. A homeless person camping in an abandoned building was routine, something that could be handled with a simple trespassing citation and referral to social services. Someone who'd established a long-term residence in the ruins of a failed theme park suggested psychological issues that might have broader implications for community safety. Trevor Wilson was the kind of county employee Brandon had worked with for years. Steady, reliable, not prone to exaggeration or panic. If Trevor was shaken by what he'd found, it was something genuinely disturbing. Brandon had learned over the years to trust the instincts of people who worked with their hands and saw the evidence of human behavior in the modifications people made to their environments. Anyone actually seen this person? Any evidence of current occupation? That's what's got us spooked, Trevor continued, glancing nervously toward the haunted castle, as if he expected to see someone watching them from the darkened windows. The place looks like whoever was living there left recently, maybe within the last week or two. Food in containers that's still fresh, newspapers dated from last month, clothes hanging on makeshift lines like somebody was planning to come back. The timing was concerning. Had something spooked the unknown resident into leaving, or were they simply away temporarily on business that Brandon didn't want to think about too carefully? The implications of someone using an abandoned theme park as a base of operations were numerous, and none of them were good. Brandon made notes while trying to assess the potential risks and determine what resources he would need for a proper investigation. An unstable individual who'd been living undetected for years in an abandoned theme park could pose threats to the community that went beyond simple trespassing. The proximity to schools and residential areas made the situation particularly concerning. "Show me what you found," Brandon said, checking his radio to ensure he had communication with dispatch. He wanted backup available quickly if the situation deteriorated, and he had a feeling that what they were about to discover would require more resources than a simple inspection could provide. The walk to the haunted castle took them through what had once been the park's main thoroughfare, past vendor stands where paint peeled like diseased skin and decorative elements that had been designed to delight children now appeared sinister in their decay. Cartoon characters that had once smiled welcomingly at families now leered with expressions that seemed malevolent in the harsh afternoon light. Their bright colors faded to sickly pastels that suggested disease and corruption. The afternoon heat was oppressive, made worse by the lack of shade and the way the abandoned buildings seemed to trap and reflect the sun's energy like a solar oven. Brandon could feel sweat gathering under his uniform despite the relatively short walk, and he wondered how anyone could have chosen to live in this environment year-round without air conditioning or proper ventilation. Brandon noticed details that spoke to the park's final desperate years. Hastily patched concrete where settlement had caused cracks, cheap repairs that hadn't been built to last more than a season or two, signs of deferred maintenance that suggested financial troubles long before the hurricane provided the final excuse for closure. He'd seen the same patterns at other failed businesses throughout Central Florida, dreams that couldn't survive the reality of competition and changing consumer preferences. The Midway's silence was almost oppressive after years of conditioning to associate such places with crowds, music, and the sounds of mechanical rides. Brandon found himself listening for the echoes of children's laughter or the mechanical whir of carnival games. But there was only the whisper of wind through broken structures and the distant buzz of insects that had claimed the ruins as their own territory. Weeds grew through cracks in the walkways where thousands of families had once strolled with anticipation and excitement, and vines had begun to reclaim the artificial landscapes that had been designed to transport visitors to fantasy worlds of adventure and wonder. Nature was patient but relentless, slowly erasing the evidence of human ambition and returning the land to its natural state. The haunted castle loomed ahead of them, its artificial weathering now supplemented by genuine decay that made it look more authentically medieval than it ever had during operation. Vines had covered much of the exterior walls, and several windows were missing glass, giving the structure the appearance of dead eyes staring out over the ruined park with malevolent intelligence. The building's design had been impressive in its heyday. Battlements that cast dramatic shadows, towers that rose above the surrounding structures to create an imposing silhouette. Architectural details that had been crafted by skilled artisans to evoke genuine medieval fortresses. Now, with paint peeling and stonework crumbling, it looked like something from a genuine ghost story rather than a manufactured entertainment experience. The entrance to the attraction had been secured with county locks after the park's closure, heavy-duty hardware designed to keep out vandals and trespassers. But Trevor led them around to a service door that had been carefully modified to provide access while appearing undisturbed from the outside. The lock had been replaced with one that looked identical to the county's standard security hardware, but closer inspection revealed subtle differences that suggested sophisticated lockpicking skills or inside knowledge of county procedures. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing," Brandon observed, examining the modified entrance with the eye of someone who'd spent years investigating break-ins and security violations. "This isn't random vandalism or desperate shelter-seeking. This shows planning and technical skill." The lock replacement was so expertly done that it would have passed casual inspection by anyone not specifically looking for signs of tampering. Only the slight differences in manufacturing marks and hardware specifications revealed that it wasn't the original county lock. Whoever had done this work had access to specialized tools and knowledge of security systems that suggested either professional training or extensive criminal experience. Trevor nodded grimly, his expression showing the unease that came from realizing that someone had been systematically defeating security measures designed to protect county property. "That's what worried us. We've dealt with homeless camps and drug users in abandoned buildings before. This is different. This is someone who took time to study how we secure these places and figured out how to beat our systems without us knowing." The interior of the haunted castle was a maze of corridors, chambers, and hidden passages designed to disorient visitors and create maximum dramatic impact. In its heyday, the attraction had featured over 30 different scenes, each designed to trigger specific psychological responses through carefully crafted combinations of visual, auditory, and tactile stimuli that played on universal human fears and anxieties. Now, with the power off and the special effects silent, the building felt genuinely haunted in ways its designers had never intended. Emergency lighting provided minimal illumination that created deep shadows and visual distortions, casting shapes that seemed to move independently and creating the kind of atmosphere that made Brandon's hand drift unconsciously toward his service weapon. The original attraction's props remained in place throughout the corridors. Mannequins dressed as medieval torture victims, fake spider webs that had collected real dust and debris over the years, mechanical devices that had once moved and made sounds to startle visitors. In the dim light and oppressive silence, these remnants of manufactured terror took on an authenticity that made Brandon's skin crawl and his nerves tense with anticipation of genuine danger. "The living area is in the back section," Trevor explained, leading them through corridors lined with defunct animatronic figures that seemed to watch their progress with dead eyes. "Whoever set this up chose a part of the building that couldn't be seen from outside and had access to the building's utilities." As they moved deeper into the attraction, Brandon began to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. The unknown resident hadn't simply camped in an empty building like a typical homeless person seeking basic shelter. They had methodically converted portions of the attraction into a functional living space while maintaining the appearance of abandonment from the outside, creating an invisible residence within the ruins. The transformation they discovered was remarkable in its thoroughness and disturbing in its implications. Someone had converted 3 of the attraction's chambers into a comfortable living space, complete with sleeping area, kitchen facilities, and what appeared to be an entertainment center with television, stereo equipment, and hundreds of books and videotapes arranged with obsessive organization. The electrical work was professional grade, tapping into the building's main power grid in ways that wouldn't be detected by cursory inspections or routine maintenance checks. The modifications were hidden within existing infrastructure, piggybacking on systems that were still functional while avoiding circuits that would show unusual power consumption. Plumbing modifications provided running water and waste disposal through connections to county utility systems that wouldn't register as unauthorized usage. Ventilation improvements ensured air circulation and temperature control that made the living space comfortable even during Florida's oppressive summer months. The unknown resident had essentially created a self-contained apartment within the abandoned attraction, complete with all the amenities necessary for long-term habitation. This represents months or years of work, Brandon noted, studying the electrical installations and plumbing modifications with growing amazement at their sophistication. Whoever did this had significant technical skills and access to quality materials and tools. The level of craftsmanship was impressive, showing attention to detail and professional competence that suggested either formal training in construction and electrical work or extensive experience with building modification and utility systems. This wasn't the desperate improvisation of someone seeking temporary shelter, but the methodical construction of a permanent residence by someone who intended to remain undetected indefinitely. But it was the personal belongings that made Brandon's investigation instincts shift into high gear and his stomach clench with growing dread about what they might be dealing with. The living space contained hundreds of photographs, many showing children at various theme parks and family entertainment venues throughout Florida and neighboring states. These weren't casual vacation snapshots taken by proud parents, but deliberate surveillance-style images taken from distances that suggested the subjects were unaware they were being photographed. The photographs were organized in albums and filing systems that suggested obsessive attention to detail and systematic long-term surveillance operations. Children were categorized by age groups, physical characteristics, and behavioral observations noted in meticulous handwriting that showed the careful attention to detail of someone conducting scientific research or intelligence-gathering operations. Some photographs had additional notations about family situations, home addresses, daily routines, and school attendance patterns that could only have been obtained through extended surveillance and possibly through unauthorized access to personal information databases. The scope and detail of the information suggested someone with significant resources and possibly professional training in surveillance techniques. Brandon's stomach clenched as he recognized the systematic nature of what they'd discovered. This wasn't random picture-taking or innocent interest in children's activities. This was the kind of organized surveillance operation that predators use to identify and track potential victims over extended periods, gathering the detailed intelligence necessary for successful abduction or exploitation attempts. "Jordan, I need you to call this into the state police immediately," Brandon said, recognizing that what they'd discovered went far beyond simple trespassing or even stalking charges. "We're looking at potential surveillance of minors, systematic predatory behavior, and possibly worse. I want forensics teams and behavioral analysts here as soon as possible." The entertainment center revealed additional disturbing evidence that confirmed Brandon's worst fears about what they were dealing with. Videotapes contained recordings of children at various public venues, often focused on specific individuals who appeared in the photograph collections. The recordings showed the same systematic approach to surveillance that characterized the photographic evidence, with detailed attention to children's behavior patterns, family interactions, and security vulnerabilities at the venues where they were filmed. Brandon forced himself to examine the videotapes methodically, though the content made him increasingly uncomfortable and angry at the violation of innocent children's privacy and safety. The recordings showed sophisticated understanding of how to conduct surveillance without detection, camera angles that avoided security systems, timing that minimized the risk of discovery, techniques for following subjects without attracting attention from parents or security personnel. The unknown resident had been operating like a professional intelligence gatherer, but instead of collecting information for legitimate purposes, they had been studying children with the kind of systematic attention that suggested predatory intentions of the worst possible kind. The scope and sophistication of the operation was unlike anything Brandon had encountered in his career, suggesting someone with extensive training and resources. Brandon found journals that documented the unknown resident's activities over several years, written in the precise handwriting of someone accustomed to detailed record-keeping and systematic documentation. The entries described surveillance operations, analysis of security procedures at various family entertainment venues, and psychological observations about children's behavior that suggested extensive study of child psychology and predatory techniques. The journal entries were written in a clinical, detached style that made them even more disturbing than emotional ravings would have been. The author described children like a scientist studying laboratory specimens, noting their responses to various stimuli and analyzing their vulnerability to different approaches with the cold objectivity of someone conducting research rather than planning crimes. Most disturbing were entries that described specific children in terms that suggested the writer viewed them as potential targets for activities that weren't explicitly described but were clearly predatory in nature. The journals contained detailed information about dozens of children, including their names, home addresses, family situations, daily routines, and behavioral patterns that could only have been obtained through extensive surveillance and possibly through unauthorized access to school and medical records. One journal entry particularly caught Brandon's attention, written in the same precise handwriting but with an undercurrent of excitement that suggested escalating behavior. Subject 23 shows typical patterns of trust in authority figures. Parents frequently distracted during venue visits, minimal supervision in areas away from main attractions. Security protocols at location appear insufficient for preventing isolated contact. Recommend continued observation to identify optimal approach timing. The clinical language couldn't disguise the predatory intent behind the observations, and Brandon felt his anger rising as he realized he was reading the notes of someone who had been systematically studying children with the intention of exploiting their innocence and vulnerability. The level of detail and planning suggested someone who had been developing these capabilities over an extended period. "Sheriff," Deputy Brooks called from across the living area, his voice tight with tension. "You need to see this." He was standing near a desk area where the unknown resident had apparently conducted research and planning activities. The desk was covered with maps of Central Florida marked with locations of schools, parks, playgrounds, and family entertainment venues throughout the region. The maps showed systematic analysis of security procedures, traffic patterns, and escape routes from dozens of locations where children congregated regularly. Some locations were marked with dates and times that corresponded to entries in the journals, suggesting the resident had conducted surveillance operations over an extended period while building detailed intelligence about potential target locations. Brandon studied the maps while trying to suppress his growing horror at the implications of what they'd discovered. This wasn't random predatory behavior, but a sophisticated operation that had been planned and executed over years by someone with extensive knowledge of law enforcement procedures and child protection protocols. The level of detail was staggering and deeply disturbing. The unknown resident had documented security camera locations at dozens of venues, identified blind spots where activities wouldn't be recorded, and analyzed staffing patterns to determine when supervision would be minimal. They had even researched local law enforcement response times and patrol patterns, suggesting they were planning activities that would require avoiding detection by authorities. Some locations had additional notations about optimal approach windows and extraction routes that suggested the resident had been planning not just surveillance, but actual contact with children that might progress to abduction or worse. The systematic nature of the planning was terrifying in its implications for child safety throughout the region. "Trevor," Brandon said to the maintenance supervisor, his voice tight with controlled anger, "I need you and your crew to leave the building immediately and wait outside. This is now an active crime scene, and I can't have anyone else contaminating potential evidence." As the maintenance crew departed, Brandon continued his examination of the living space while waiting for backup and forensic specialists to arrive. Each new discovery reinforced his conviction that they were dealing with a highly intelligent and organized predator who had used the abandoned theme park as a base of operations for activities that posed extreme danger to the community's children. The kitchen area contained evidence of recent occupation that suggested the unknown resident's departure had been sudden rather than planned. Fresh food in containers, recent newspapers, and personal items that appeared to have been abandoned in the middle of daily routines. A calendar on the wall had dates marked that corresponded to school schedules and community events where children would be present in large numbers. Brandon noticed that several of the marked dates were in the near future, suggesting the unknown resident had been planning additional surveillance operations or possibly more direct contact with potential victims. The timing of their departure from the haunted castle might be related to specific planned activities rather than random circumstances, which raised urgent questions about where they had gone and what they might be planning. Brandon's radio crackled with updates from dispatch as state police investigators prepared to respond to the scene. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement was coordinating resources for what was clearly going to be a major investigation with potential connections to other cases throughout the state and region. FBI specialists who dealt with crimes against children were being contacted, and Brandon knew that within hours the abandoned theme park would be crawling with federal agents and forensic specialists. The scope of what they'd discovered suggested connections to other cases and possibly to networks of predators operating throughout the Southeast. The bedroom area revealed additional disturbing evidence that confirmed the predatory nature of the operation. Children's clothing and toys were carefully arranged in ways that suggested they held particular significance for the unknown resident. Some items appeared to be souvenirs or trophies, possibly taken from encounters with children that had escalated beyond surveillance into direct contact, or worse. Brandon photographed everything while maintaining careful documentation of the scene's condition and the location of each piece of evidence. His years of experience had taught him that cases like this often involved activities in multiple jurisdictions, and thorough evidence collection would be crucial for successful prosecution and for identifying other potential victims who might need protection or treatment. A small alcove off the bedroom contained what appeared to be a shrine dedicated to specific children whose photographs were displayed prominently alongside personal items and detailed written observations. These seemed to be the unknown resident's primary targets, children who had been selected for special attention based on criteria that weren't immediately obvious, but probably related to their vulnerability and accessibility. The bathroom contained personal hygiene items and medications that could provide important clues about the resident's identity and psychological condition. Prescription bottles with names that had been deliberately obscured might yield fingerprints or other forensic evidence that could help identify the individual responsible for the elaborate surveillance operation. As Brandon waited for the forensic team's arrival, he studied the journals more carefully, looking for patterns that might help predict where the unknown resident had gone or what they might be planning next. The entries revealed increasing frustration with security improvements at various venues and references to finding new opportunities that suggested the individual was actively seeking alternative locations for their activities. The most recent journal entries, dated within the past month, described reconnaissance of elementary schools and daycare centers in neighboring counties. The entries included detailed observations about security procedures, staffing patterns, and opportunities for unsupervised access to children that suggested the resident was planning to escalate their activities beyond surveillance. One entry from 3 weeks ago was particularly ominous and made Brandon's blood run cold. Traditional venues becoming too restrictive due to enhanced security awareness among parents and staff may need to develop alternative approach methods that don't rely on public access. Residential areas offer better access opportunities with reduced surveillance. Recommend transition to neighborhood-based operations for direct contact opportunities. Brandon realized they were dealing with someone who posed an immediate and ongoing threat to children throughout Central Florida and possibly beyond. The individual's sudden departure from the haunted castle suggested they might be aware that their activities were at risk of discovery, which could lead to escalation or desperate actions as they sought to avoid capture. The arrival of the state police forensic team brought additional resources and expertise to the investigation, along with the kind of systematic approach that major crimes required. Crime scene specialists began methodical collection of evidence, while behavioral analysts studied the journals and photograph collections to develop a psychological profile of the unknown predator. FBI Special Agent Dustin Clark, who specialized in crimes against children, took charge of coordinating the federal aspects of the investigation. His preliminary assessment confirmed Brandon's worst fears about the scope and sophistication of the operation they'd uncovered. "This individual has been conducting systematic surveillance of children for years," Clark explained to Brandon as they stood outside the haunted castle, watching forensic teams process the scene. "The level of organization and planning suggests someone with law enforcement or military training, possibly with inside knowledge of how child protection investigations are conducted." Agent Clark's experience with similar cases provided valuable context for understanding what they'd discovered, but he confirmed that the scale and duration of the Wonderland Springs operation was unusual even by FBI standards. Most predators operated more impulsively and with less systematic planning than what they'd found in the abandoned theme park. The forensic examination revealed fingerprints throughout the living space, but initial database searches failed to identify the unknown resident. The individual had either never been arrested or had somehow avoided having their fingerprints entered into law enforcement databases, which suggested either exceptional caution or possible connections to networks that specialized in helping predators avoid detection. DNA evidence collected from personal items would require laboratory analysis that could take weeks to complete, but hair samples, saliva traces, and other biological evidence might eventually provide identification. The immediate priority was protecting potential victims while the predator remained at large and possibly planning escalated activities. Agent Clark established coordination with law enforcement agencies throughout Central Florida, sharing information about the surveillance targets identified in the journals and photographs. Schools and daycare centers were provided with security advisories, and parents were warned about individuals who might be conducting surveillance of their children through emergency notification systems. The investigation expanded to include examination of similar abandoned properties throughout the region. If the unknown predator had used Wonderland Springs as a base of operations, they might have established alternative locations for their activities, or had backup plans that involved other abandoned buildings with similar advantages for concealment and infrastructure access. Brandon coordinated the local aspects of the investigation while working with federal agents to understand the broader implications of what they'd discovered. The sophistication of the operation suggested the individual might be connected to other predators, or might have been operating in multiple locations over an extended period, possibly as part of a larger network that specialized in child exploitation and surveillance. The journals contained references to others who understand and people who share similar interests, suggesting the possibility of communication or coordination with other individuals involved in predatory activities. Some entries described meetings or communications with other people, though the references were coded in ways that made identification difficult without additional context or investigation. The photograph collections included images taken at theme parks and entertainment venues throughout the southeastern United States, suggesting the individual had traveled extensively in pursuit of surveillance targets. Some photographs showed children at locations hundreds of miles from Central Florida, indicating the scope of the operation extended far beyond Brandon's jurisdiction and possibly into multiple states. Agent Clark's analysis of the surveillance methods revealed sophisticated techniques that suggested professional training or extensive study of law enforcement procedures. The individual knew how to avoid security cameras, conduct surveillance without attracting attention, and gather detailed information about targets without triggering protective responses from parents or security personnel. The modifications to the haunted castle's infrastructure showed similar professional competence that impressed even the federal investigators. The electrical and plumbing work was expertly done, and the security modifications were sophisticated enough to avoid detection during routine inspections. The individual had essentially created an invisible base of operations in plain sight of law enforcement oversight. Brandon's investigation of the park's history revealed troubling connections to the incidents he'd investigated years earlier as a deputy. The timeline suggested the unknown predator had been using Wonderland Springs as a base of operations, even while the park was still in operation, possibly explaining the strange incidents that had contributed to the park's declining reputation and eventual closure. The realization that the predator had been operating for over a decade while avoiding detection raised disturbing questions about how many children might have been affected by their activities. The journals documented surveillance of hundreds of children, but the references to special opportunities and close encounters suggested some interactions had progressed beyond mere observation. One journal entry from several years earlier provided chilling insight into the predator's escalating behavior and made Brandon's investigation of those old cases take on new significance. Direct contact achieved with Subject 47 during park visit. Child responded positively to friendly employee approach. Family distraction provided 15-minute window for extended conversation away from attraction area. Gathered detailed information about home situation and daily routines. Recommend follow-up surveillance at residential location. Brandon realized with growing horror that the incidents he'd investigated as a deputy might have been just the tip of the iceberg. Cases where children or parents had been alert enough to recognize that something wasn't right. How many other encounters had gone unreported because children didn't understand what was happening or were too intimidated to tell their parents about conversations with friendly park employees? Brandon worked with victim advocacy specialists to develop procedures for identifying and supporting children who might have been affected by the predator's activities. The process was complicated by the extended timeline and the possibility that some victims might not remember encounters that had occurred years earlier when they were very young, or might have suppressed memories of experiences that had made them uncomfortable. The task of identifying potential victims was daunting, given the scope of the surveillance operation. The photograph collections contained images of hundreds of children taken over several years at dozens of locations throughout the Southeast. Many of the children would now be teenagers or young adults, and contacting them would require careful coordination with their families and consideration of the psychological impact of learning they had been targeted by a predator. The media attention surrounding the investigation created additional challenges for law enforcement efforts. News coverage of the abandoned theme park discovery attracted curiosity seekers and amateur investigators who interfered with ongoing evidence collection and potentially contaminated crime scenes that might contain additional evidence. Brandon established security perimeters around Wonderland Springs and other locations connected to the investigation, but the remote nature of many sites made complete security impossible. The publicity also raised concerns that the unknown predator might alter their behavior or flee the area to avoid capture, potentially putting children in other jurisdictions at risk. The psychological profile developed by FBI behavioral analysts described an individual with sophisticated understanding of child psychology and predatory techniques. The person was likely highly intelligent, well-educated, and capable of maintaining a normal public appearance while conducting extensive criminal activities in secret. The profile suggested the individual might work in a profession that provided legitimate access to children, or might use volunteer activities to establish contact with potential victims. Teachers, coaches, youth group leaders, and other child care professionals became focus areas for the investigation, as did individuals who worked in maintenance or security roles that provided access to venues where children congregated. Brandon coordinated background checks of individuals who had worked at Wonderland Springs during its operational years, looking for connections to the unknown predator. Employee records revealed several individuals who had exhibited concerning behavior or had been terminated for violations of child protection policies during the park's 20-year operational period. The investigation expanded to include former employees who had maintained access to the park after its closure, or who had demonstrated knowledge of the building's layout and utility systems. Maintenance workers, security guards, and management personnel all became potential suspects in the investigation, as did contractors who had worked on the park's infrastructure during its operational years. One former employee, Casey Martinez, had worked as a maintenance technician at Wonderland Springs for 5 years before the park's closure. Personnel records showed he had been reprimanded multiple times for inappropriate interactions with children and had been suspected of using his position to gain unauthorized access to park areas after hours for purposes that weren't related to his job duties. Martinez had disappeared shortly after the park's closure, leaving no forwarding address and failing to collect his final paycheck or provide proper notice to his supervisor. Attempts to locate him through standard databases had been unsuccessful, suggesting he might be using false identification or might have left the state entirely to avoid potential investigation. Brandon's investigation of Martinez revealed a pattern of employment at family entertainment venues throughout the Southeast, often ending with sudden departures following complaints about inappropriate behavior with children. The pattern suggested someone who used legitimate employment to gain access to potential victims while avoiding long-term scrutiny that might expose their predatory activities. The personnel files from Wonderland Springs painted a disturbing picture of Martinez's behavior during his employment that should have triggered more aggressive investigation at the time. Supervisors had documented instances of him lingering around areas where children congregated, asking inappropriate questions about young visitors' personal information, and showing unusual interest in families' travel plans and home addresses. One incident report from Martinez's final year at the park was particularly concerning and made Brandon angry that more hadn't been done to investigate at the time. Employee observed engaging child in extended conversation near restroom facilities. Child appeared uncomfortable and was attempting to leave conversation. When approached by supervisor, employee claimed he was providing directions to lost child. Parents later confirmed child had not been lost and was disturbed by encounter with employee who had asked personal questions about family. The incident reports showed a pattern of behavior that should have triggered immediate termination and possible criminal investigation, but park management had been more concerned about avoiding negative publicity than protecting children. The reports had been filed but not forwarded to law enforcement, and Martinez had been allowed to continue working with minimal supervision until the park's closure. The forensic examination of the haunted castle living space eventually yielded fingerprint matches to Casey Martinez, confirming his identity as the unknown predator and providing law enforcement with a specific target for their investigation. However, Martinez's current whereabouts remained unknown, and his ability to avoid detection for over a decade suggested he had developed sophisticated methods for evading law enforcement. FBI databases revealed that Martinez had been using multiple false identities to obtain employment at various entertainment venues throughout the Southeast, each time abandoning the identity when suspicions arose about his activities. The sophisticated identity fraud suggested extensive planning and possibly assistance from others involved in similar criminal activities, or from networks that specialized in helping fugitives avoid detection. The investigation expanded to include examination of entertainment venues where Martinez had worked under his various false identities. Law enforcement agencies in multiple states began reviewing unsolved cases involving missing children or reports of inappropriate behavior by employees or volunteers, looking for patterns that might connect to Martinez's activities. Brandon worked with federal agents to develop strategies for locating Martinez while protecting potential victims at venues where he might seek employment. The challenge was complicated by his demonstrated ability to assume false identities and his extensive knowledge of how background check procedures worked, allowing him to exploit weaknesses in hiring systems. The search for Martinez led investigators to a network of individuals who specialized in providing false identification documents to people seeking to avoid law enforcement detection. The network included corrupt government employees, document forgers, and facilitators who helped clients establish new identities in different states while maintaining plausible employment histories. The investigation revealed that Martinez had been receiving assistance from this network for over a decade, allowing him to maintain multiple identities simultaneously and avoid detection by law enforcement agencies. The sophistication of the operation suggested connections to organized crime or other criminal enterprises that required similar identity services for their operations. Brandon's coordination with federal agencies expanded to include investigation of the false identity network and its connections to other criminal activities. The network had provided services to individuals involved in drug trafficking, financial fraud, and other serious crimes, in addition to predators like Martinez who needed to avoid scrutiny for their activities. The scope of the investigation grew to encompass multiple federal agencies and law enforcement organizations throughout the southeastern United States. The connections between the false identity network and various criminal enterprises made the case a priority for agencies investigating organized crime and public corruption, in addition to child exploitation. 6 months after the discovery at Wonderland Springs, investigators finally located Casey Martinez at a water park in South Carolina where he had been working under another false identity as a maintenance supervisor. His arrest was coordinated with local law enforcement to minimize the risk of escape and ensure the safety of potential victims at the facility where he was employed. Martinez's capture led to the discovery of additional evidence that revealed the full scope of his predatory activities over more than a decade. Storage units in multiple states contained surveillance equipment, additional photographs and videos of children, and documentation of planned activities that had been prevented by his arrest. The evidence collected during the expanded investigation ultimately led to Martinez's conviction on federal charges related to surveillance and exploitation of minors, interstate transportation of child pornography, and identity fraud. His sentence of 35 years in federal prison ensured he would be unable to harm additional children for the remainder of his natural life. During his interrogation following arrest, Martinez revealed details about his methods and motivations that provided valuable intelligence for preventing similar operations. His confession confirmed that he had been using the Wonderland Springs location for over a decade, first while employed at the park and later as his primary base of operations for surveillance and planning activities. Martinez described how he had gradually established his hidden residence in the haunted castle, taking advantage of his maintenance access to modify the building's systems without detection. He had carefully studied the park's security procedures and county inspection routines to ensure his presence would remain undetected while he pursued his predatory activities. Most disturbing was Martinez's revelation that he had made direct contact with dozens of children over the years, using his knowledge of their families and routines to approach them in settings where his presence wouldn't arouse suspicion. Many of these contacts had never been reported, leaving families unaware that their children had been targeted by a predator with sophisticated surveillance capabilities. The confession revealed that Martinez had used his position at various entertainment venues to gather intelligence about children and their families, building detailed profiles that he used to plan approaches and evaluate vulnerability. His systematic approach had allowed him to avoid detection while gradually escalating his predatory behavior over an extended period. The investigation's impact extended far beyond Martinez's conviction to include improved security procedures at family entertainment venues throughout the region. Background check procedures were enhanced to include more thorough verification of employment history and identity documentation, and employee monitoring systems were improved to detect suspicious behavior before it could escalate. Coordination between law enforcement agencies was strengthened to prevent similar operations from developing undetected across jurisdictional boundaries. Information sharing protocols were established to ensure that suspicious employment patterns or identity fraud activities would be flagged more quickly by investigators in different states. Brandon's role in the investigation earned him recognition from federal law enforcement agencies and led to his appointment as a liaison officer for crimes against children in Central Florida. His experience with the case made him valuable in training other law enforcement personnel to recognize signs of predatory surveillance and investigation techniques that could detect sophisticated criminal operations. The training programs Brandon developed emphasized the importance of thorough investigation of abandoned properties and systematic analysis of employment patterns at venues where children might be vulnerable. His methods became standard protocols for investigating suspicious activities that might indicate predatory surveillance or exploitation operations. Brandon's expertise in abandoned property investigations led to the discovery of similar operations in other locations throughout Florida and neighboring states. His techniques for recognizing signs of unauthorized long-term occupation and systematic modification of building infrastructure helped other law enforcement agencies identify criminal operations that had been operating undetected. The Wonderland Springs property was eventually demolished rather than developed, with the county determining that the site's association with criminal activities made it unsuitable for family-oriented recreational use. The demolition was symbolic of the community's commitment to protecting children from predators who might exploit abandoned properties for criminal purposes. The demolition also provided closure for families who had been affected by the investigation, allowing them to see concrete action being taken to prevent similar operations from being established in the future. The destruction of the buildings where Martinez had conducted his surveillance activities helped reduce the psychological impact on community members who had been disturbed by learning about the scope of his predatory behavior. Brandon's reflection on the case often focuses on the importance of thorough investigation of abandoned properties and the need for communities to maintain awareness of potential threats to children. The case demonstrated that sophisticated predators could operate undetected for years if law enforcement agencies failed to recognize the signs of their activities or coordinate effectively across jurisdictions. The lessons learned from the Wonderland Springs investigation became part of training programs for law enforcement officers throughout Florida and other states with similar abandoned entertainment venues. Brandon's experience helped develop protocols for investigating suspicious activities at abandoned properties and recognizing signs of predatory surveillance operations before they could claim victims. The case files from the investigation eventually filled over 40 boxes of evidence and documentation, representing one of the most comprehensive investigations of child predator activities ever conducted in Central Florida. The evidence collected helped solve additional cases in other jurisdictions and provided valuable intelligence about predator methods and network operations that assisted other investigations. Brandon continues to serve as sheriff of Manatee County, but his experience with the Wonderland Springs case fundamentally changed his approach to community safety and child protection. He maintains constant vigilance for signs of predatory activities and works closely with schools, daycare centers, and family entertainment venues to ensure proper security procedures are followed. The empty lot where Wonderland Springs once stood serves as a reminder of the importance of community awareness and law enforcement vigilance in protecting children from those who would exploit their innocence and vulnerability. Brandon visits the site occasionally, remembering the case that defined his career and reinforced his commitment to protecting the community's most vulnerable residents. The Wonderland Springs investigation revealed that childhood memories could be tainted by adult knowledge of evil that had lurked unseen in places designed for innocent joy. For Brandon and the entire community, the abandoned theme park would forever represent both the vulnerability of children and the responsibility of adults to protect them from predators who hide behind masks of normalcy and respectability. The case served as a permanent reminder that threats to children could emerge from unexpected sources and could operate undetected for years if communities and law enforcement agencies failed to maintain appropriate vigilance. The systematic nature of Martinez's operation demonstrated the importance of thorough background investigations and ongoing monitoring of individuals who worked with children in any capacity. Brandon's experience with the case influenced his approach to all subsequent investigations involving potential threats to children. He learned to look beyond obvious explanations and to consider the possibility that seemingly isolated incidents might be part of larger patterns of predatory behavior that required extensive investigation to fully understand and address. The Wonderland Springs case became a landmark investigation that influenced child protection policies and procedures throughout Florida and beyond. The methods developed during the investigation helped other law enforcement agencies recognize and respond to similar threats, potentially preventing countless children from becoming victims of predatory exploitation. For Brandon Mitchell, sheriff of Manatee County, the abandoned theme park investigation represented both the darkest aspects of human nature and the importance of law enforcement's role in protecting society's most vulnerable members. The case reinforced his commitment to thorough investigation and community protection while demonstrating that even the most sophisticated criminal operations could be detected and disrupted through persistent effort and effective coordination between agencies. The legacy of the Wonderland Springs investigation continues to influence child protection efforts throughout the region, serving as a reminder that constant vigilance is required to protect children from those who would exploit their innocence for predatory purposes. Brandon's work on the case ensured that Casey Martinez's years of undetected predatory activity would not be repeated, providing a measure of justice for his victims and protection for future generations of children.